A wealthy businessman hired a poor woman to be his bride, but at dinner she said something unexpected. What happened next surprised everyone. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The morning light spilled across the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, casting a golden hue over the city that never sleeps. William Hargrove sat in his penthouse office on the 60th floor of Hargrove Enterprises. The vast expanse of glass behind him revealed a city pulsating with ambition and noise, but the man himself radiated an air of controlled calm, his neatly pressed suit a metaphor for the life he had curated. At 38, William embodied success, a self-made tycoon with an empire spanning industries, admired by peers and feared by competitors. The office, minimal yet meticulously designed, mirrored his character. A grand mahogany desk stood in the center, clutter-free except for a sleek laptop, a glass of water, and a framed photo of a younger William with a stern-looking woman. Harriet Hargrove, his mother, had been the unyielding architect of his early years. She raised him to believe that respect came only with wealth, and wealth was the ultimate measure of a man. It was a lesson he had absorbed, perfected, and wielded with precision. This morning, however, something gnawed at the edges of his well-maintained composure. The board meeting from the previous evening played on a loop in his mind. Charles Wentworth, his senior partner and longtime family ally, had leaned across the polished conference table, his voice laden with a mix of concern and thinly veiled criticism. William, international expansion isn't just about numbers. It's about trust, stability. A man's life must reflect his company's values. Investors want to know they're backing someone reliable, grounded, even in his personal life. It wasn't a new sentiment. The other directors had nodded, some hesitantly, others with open agreement. The implication was clear. The absence of a steady partner in William's life had become a liability. His success was unquestionable, but his solitude, interpreted by many as arrogance, cast a shadow over the pristine image of Hargrove Enterprises. He swiveled his chair to face the sprawling cityscape, fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. Marriage, stability, trust. Words thrown at him by men who had spent decades ensconced in family dinners and anniversary toasts. For William, the notion felt foreign, a language he had never bothered to learn. His relationships had always been fleeting, transactional. The idea of blending his carefully guarded world with someone else's seemed messy, unpredictable. A chime interrupted his musings. Eleanor Parker, his public relations consultant, entered the office with her usual brisk efficiency. In her mid-40s, Eleanor was one of the few people who spoke candidly with him. "Good morning, William. I hope I'm not intruding." She placed a folder on his desk, her tone warm yet professional. "I've been reviewing the feedback from last night's meeting. It's clear the board's concerns won't disappear unless addressed directly." "Your insights are always appreciated, Eleanor," he replied, his voice smooth but tinged with weariness. She hesitated before continuing. "There's talk of a gala dinner next month. The international investors will be there. If you could present yourself as more approachable, it might ease their concerns. Perhaps even introduce someone as your fiancé." The suggestion hung in the air. William's jaw tightened imperceptibly, his mind racing ahead to the logistics, the implications, the sheer audacity of such a ruse. Yet he found himself intrigued. A controlled deception, executed perfectly, could buy him the time he needed to finalize the expansion without the board's incessant meddling. "That's absurd," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "Not if it works," Eleanor countered. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive, studied him. "You'd need someone discreet, adaptable, a professional arrangement. It wouldn't have to be permanent, just enough to satisfy their expectations." William leaned back, considering her words. The irony wasn't lost on him. For a man who orchestrated multi-billion-dollar deals with precision, the idea of simulating a personal connection felt strangely daunting. Eleanor mistook his silence for dismissal. "I'll leave the file here," she said, gesturing to the folder. "It contains profiles of potential candidates, just in case." After she left, William opened the folder with measured curiosity. The profiles were concise, efficient, and largely uninspiring. None of the candidates sparked anything beyond mild interest until his gaze settled on the last page. The woman's name was Sarah Thompson, and unlike the others, her profile carried a striking simplicity. No high-profile education, no ties to influential families. A freelancer who supplemented her income by attending social events as a companion for hire. He frowned, reading further. Brooklyn resident, late 20s, graduated in business administration. Her photograph revealed soft features framed by wavy chestnut hair, her expression reserved but unmistakably honest. Something about her stood out, not in the traditional sense of beauty or accomplishment, but in the quiet confidence that seemed to emanate even through a photograph. William closed the folder and tapped his desk, his mind already assembling the pieces of a plan. He prided himself on efficiency, and this would be no different. The key was clarity, boundaries, and maintaining absolute control. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the bustling city below, William reached for his phone. With each ring, he felt the weight of the decision he was about to make. When Eleanor picked up, he spoke with the calculated assurance that defined his every move. "Contact her. Let's schedule a meeting." In that moment, the unshakable William Hargrove took his first step into unfamiliar territory, unwittingly setting the stage for a transformation he couldn't yet foresee. The door to the modest apartment creaked softly as Sarah Thompson pushed it open, balancing a paper grocery bag on her hip. The scent of fresh bread and ground coffee wafted through the narrow hallway as she set the bag on the small kitchen counter. The apartment, located in a well-worn building in Brooklyn, reflected Sarah's life, practical, unpretentious, but with a warmth that lingered in its corners. A faded but clean floral curtain fluttered near the cracked window pane, letting in just enough sunlight to brighten the space. Emily," Sarah called out, setting her keys down with a soft jingle. Her sister's voice floated from the adjacent room, followed by the hurried sound of footsteps. Emily, 5 years younger and perpetually on edge about her nursing studies, appeared with a textbook clutched in one hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear. "Hey, you're back early," Emily said, her face lighting up at the sight of Sarah. "Did you get the coffee?" Sarah chuckled, pulling a small tin from the bag and holding it up. "Do I ever forget?" The sisters shared a smile, a silent acknowledgement of their routines and the comfort they found in each other. For Sarah, every moment with Emily was a reminder of why she pushed herself so hard. Their mother, Margaret, had taught them resilience before her health began to deteriorate. Now, Sarah bore the weight of keeping their fragile world together while Emily focused on completing her nursing degree, a future Sarah fiercely protected. "How's Mom today?" Sarah asked, moving to the cabinet to put away the groceries. "Better than yesterday," Emily replied, her tone careful. "She managed to eat a little this morning. I think the new medication might be helping." Sarah nodded, relief softening her features. Margaret had been struggling with a chronic illness that seemed to defy their best efforts. Sarah's shifts at the bookstore and her evening gigs as a waitress barely covered the growing pile of medical bills, yet she carried the burden without complaint, her determination to shield Emily from despair stronger than her own exhaustion. "Well, let's hope it stays that way," Sarah said, her voice firm. She turned back to Emily, a playful grin breaking through. And you stop worrying about pharmacology for 5 minutes and help me unpack these. Emily laughed, setting her textbook aside and joining Sarah at the counter. They unpacked in companionable silence, the rhythmic clinking of jars and cans filling the small kitchen. The peace was short-lived. A sharp buzz from Sarah's phone broke the quiet. She wiped her hands on a towel and picked it up, frowning at the unfamiliar number. After a brief hesitation, she answered, "Hello. Good afternoon. Is this Sarah Thompson?" The voice on the other end was smooth, professional but distant. "Yes, speaking. Who's calling?" "My name is Eleanor Parker. I'm a representative for Hargrove Enterprises. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. She knew the name. Hargrove Enterprises was one of the most prominent companies in New York, but couldn't fathom why they would be calling her. "No, it's fine." "What's this about?" Eleanor's tone remained cordial but brisk. "We received your profile through an agency for professional event companions. Mr. William Hargrove, our CEO, is interested in meeting you for a potential engagement. If you're available, we'd like to arrange an interview at your earliest convenience." Sarah froze, the words tumbling over each other in her mind. She had signed up with the agency reluctantly, a temporary solution to pay a few overdue bills. The idea of attending social events as a companion, strictly platonic, the agency emphasized, felt like a stretch from her usual work, but desperation had outweighed her reservations. "Engagement," she echoed, her voice edged with skepticism. "It would involve accompanying Mr. Hargrove to an important dinner as his fiancée," Eleanor explained matter-of-factly. "I understand it's an unconventional request, but the compensation would be substantial." Sarah's first instinct was to decline. The idea of pretending to be someone's fiancé, especially for a man like William Hargrove, seemed absurd. She pictured the towering skyscrapers, the cold gleam of corporate wealth, and the arrogance she assumed came with it. It wasn't her world. She didn't belong there. "I appreciate the offer, but—" Sarah began, but Eleanor interrupted gently. "I understand your hesitation, Miss Thompson. However, I urge you to consider the opportunity. Mr. Hargrove is prepared to offer compensation far above industry standards, and there will be a formal contract ensuring your terms and conditions are respected." Sarah glanced at Emily, who was watching her with curious concern. The mention of compensation brought Margaret's medical bills to the forefront of her mind. It wasn't just the money, it was what the money could do. Treatments, stability, maybe even a little breathing room. I'll think about it," she said finally. Eleanor's tone softened. "Take your time. I'll send the details to your email. If you decide to proceed, the meeting can be scheduled at your convenience." The call ended, leaving Sarah holding the phone as if it might burst into flames. Emily's curiosity boiled over. "What was that about?" Sarah hesitated, weighing how much to share. "It's a job offer. Strange, but it pays well." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" Sarah exhaled, placing the phone down. "It's complicated. I'll explain later." Later, as she sat alone in the quiet of the apartment, Sarah stared at the email Eleanor had sent. Her gut twisted with uncertainty, but one thought kept surfacing. She couldn't let pride stand in the way of helping her family. The sleek black car pulled up to the towering headquarters of Hargrove Enterprises, its polished exterior reflecting the relentless bustle of Midtown Manhattan. Sarah stepped out hesitantly, her simple beige coat a stark contrast to the sea of tailored suits that flowed in and out of the building. She clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white against the worn leather strap. The lobby was a cavernous space of marble and glass, bustling with the kind of quiet urgency that characterized corporate life. A uniformed concierge greeted her with a practiced smile, directing her to a private elevator. As the doors slid shut, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished metal. She adjusted her hair and took a steadying breath, determined to appear composed despite the unease simmering beneath her surface. When the elevator doors opened on the 60th floor, she was greeted by a young assistant with sharp features and a brisk manner. "Miss Thompson, Mr. Hargrove is expecting you. Please follow me." The assistant led her through a series of minimalist corridors until they reached a set of glass doors that seemed to radiate authority. The assistant knocked once before pushing the doors open, revealing the man himself. William Hargrove stood near the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the panoramic view of Manhattan. His tailored navy suit spoke of precision and control, every detail meticulously curated. He turned as they entered, his gaze cool and assessing. Sarah felt the weight of his scrutiny, but she straightened her posture, meeting his eyes with quiet resolve. "Miss Thompson," William said, his voice smooth but detached. He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Please, have a seat." Sarah moved cautiously, her every step measured. The office was as imposing as the man who occupied it. Clean lines, muted tones, and an air of understated luxury. She perched on the edge of the chair, her hands resting carefully on her lap. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," William began, settling into his chair. His expression remained unreadable as he studied her. "I assume Eleanor explained the basics of this arrangement." "She did," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Though I'm still not entirely sure why you chose me." William's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Honesty? I appreciate that." He leaned back, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "I reviewed several profiles. Yours stood out because you seemed unpretentious, genuine, qualities that align with the image I need to project." Sarah's brows furrowed slightly. "Man, what image is that?" "The board of directors believes I lack personal stability," William explained, his tone clipped. "They're pressuring me to demonstrate that I'm more than a corporate figure, that I have roots, connections, humanity, for lack of a better term." He paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "The truth is, I don't have time for a real relationship. What I need is a partner who can fulfill this role temporarily, with discretion and professionalism. In return, you'll be compensated generously." Sarah's mind raced. His words were straightforward, almost clinical, yet the underlying vulnerability wasn't lost on her. This man, who appeared to have everything, was as much a prisoner of expectations as she was. "What exactly would this arrangement entail?" she asked, her voice cautious. William slid a folder across the desk. "This contains the details. You would attend a dinner with me in 2 weeks, posing as my fiancée. The event is critical to securing international investments. After that, the extent of your involvement would depend on how well this initial engagement is received." Sarah opened the folder, scanning the contract. It was thorough, outlining boundaries and expectations with precision. The remuneration made her heart skip, a sum that could pay off her mother's medical bills, and then some. "I have some conditions," she said, closing the folder and meeting his gaze. "First, I need assurance that my privacy will be respected. My family can't be involved in this. Second, I want clear boundaries. This stays strictly professional." William nodded, his expression impassive. "Agreed." "Anything else?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder. "I'll need an advance, half of the agreed amount up front." For the first time, William's composure faltered, his brows lifting slightly. He studied her for a moment before leaning forward. "Bold? I can respect that. Done." A faint blush crept up Sarah's neck, but she refused to waver. "Then I suppose we have a deal." William extended his hand across the desk, and she shook it firmly, her smaller hand enveloped in his. The moment lingered, a quiet acknowledgement of the strange alliance they had just forged. "One more thing," William said, releasing her hand. "You'll need some preparation. Eleanor will arrange for etiquette training, wardrobe adjustments, and anything else necessary to ensure you fit the role seamlessly." Sarah nodded, the reality of the situation settling over her like a heavy cloak. She stood, smoothing the front of her coat. "I'll do my best." William's gaze softened imperceptibly. "I have no doubt you will, Ms. Thompson?" As Sarah walked back to the elevator, her mind buzzed with conflicting emotions, relief, trepidation, and a faint flicker of curiosity about the man she had just agreed to deceive the world alongside. She glanced at her reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls, her determination hardening. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same resilience that had carried her this far. Sarah stood before the mirror in the boutique fitting room, her breath catching as she took in her reflection. The dress, a midnight blue creation with delicate beading along the neckline, was unlike anything she'd ever worn. It fit perfectly, skimming her figure without clinging, its elegance understated yet undeniable. Eleanor Parker's voice floated in from outside the fitting room. "Let me see, Sarah." "We don't have all day." Reluctantly, Sarah stepped out, her hands smoothing the fabric nervously. Eleanor, perched on a chaise lounge with a tablet in hand, glanced up. Her critical gaze softened for a fraction of a second before she spoke. "Better, much better. That color complements your complexion, and the cut is appropriate." Sarah shifted uncomfortably under Eleanor's scrutiny. She wasn't used to this world of haute couture and meticulously curated appearances. Her life had been one of practicality and frugality. Spending hours deliberating over a dress was as foreign to her as the corporate towers of Midtown. "I feel like a mannequin," Sarah muttered, half to herself. Eleanor arched a brow, a hint of amusement flickering in her usually stern demeanor. "Mannequins don't speak. You, on the other hand, will need to charm some of the most influential business people in the city. This isn't just about how you look, Sarah. It's about how you carry yourself." Sarah exhaled sharply, the weight of the task pressing down on her. "And what happens if I mess up, if I say the wrong thing?" "You won't," Eleanor replied, with the same cool confidence she had wielded since their first meeting. "Because we're going to make sure you don't. Now, let's talk etiquette." The next few hours were a whirlwind of lessons. Eleanor walked Sarah through the nuances of formal dining, from navigating a multi-course meal to decoding cryptic social cues. They practiced introductions, with Eleanor playing the role of a skeptical investor or a nosy socialite. Sarah stumbled at first, but her natural quick wit and determination soon shone through. "Good," Eleanor said after Sarah successfully simulated a conversation with an imaginary board member. "But remember, less is more. You're playing the role of William Hargrove's fiancée, not a corporate strategist. They'll expect charm and grace, not a business lecture." The mention of William brought a fresh wave of unease. Though their initial meeting had been professional, Sarah couldn't ignore the guarded intensity in his eyes, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. She wondered what kind of man he was beneath the polished exterior. Later that evening, Sarah returned to the modest Brooklyn apartment she shared with Emily. The juxtaposition between the boutique's opulence and her home's simplicity was stark, but it grounded her. As she entered, Emily looked up from her laptop, her face lighting up. "You're home! How was it?" Sarah sank into the worn couch, kicking off her heels with a sigh. "Exhausting. I spent the day learning how to eat soup without offending anyone." Emily laughed, though her eyes held a glimmer of concern. "It all sounds so intense. Are you sure about this?" Sarah hesitated, the enormity of her decision surfacing. No, but the money could pay off Mum's medical bills, and maybe it's a chance to do something different, even if it's just pretending. Emily studied her sister for a moment before nodding. I get it. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself, okay? No one's worth losing who you are, not even some billionaire. The sincerity in Emily's voice touched Sarah, and she reached over, squeezing her sister's hand. I promise. The days leading up to the dinner blurred together in a flurry of preparations. Sarah met with stylists who transformed her wardrobe and appearance, though she insisted on keeping her look simple, refusing to let them erase her identity entirely. There were rehearsals for conversations, mock introductions, and endless adjustments to ensure she appeared every bit the poised and elegant fiancée of William Hargrove. On the morning of the dinner, Sarah stood in front of her closet, her carefully curated outfits lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. She felt the weight of the evening ahead, the fear of making a misstep gnawing at her. Eleanor's advice echoed in her mind. You're not just representing yourself tonight, you're representing him. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Opening it, she found a courier holding a small package addressed to her. Inside was a velvet jewelry box and a note written in neat, precise handwriting. To complete the ensemble. H. Inside the box was a pair of sapphire earrings, their brilliance rivaling the stars. Sarah's breath caught as she ran her fingers over them, a mix of awe and apprehension washing over her. The gesture was thoughtful, yet it reminded her of the magnitude of the role she was about to play. That evening, as she stepped into the Blacktown car that would take her to the event Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions, nervousness, determination, and a flicker of excitement she couldn't quite place. William was already inside, his expression unreadable as he glanced at her. You look appropriate, he said after a pause, his tone devoid of warmth but not unkind. Thanks, Sarah replied, her voice tinged with sarcasm. You really know how to make a girl feel special. His lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if suppressing a smile. Ready for tonight? Not remotely, she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. But I'll manage. William nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Good. Let's make this convincing. As the car pulled away, Sarah's grip tightened on her clutch. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she resolved to meet it with the same resilience that had carried her through every challenge before. The restaurant was a marvel of opulence, nestled in the heart of Manhattan, its grand chandeliers casting a golden glow over the polished marble floors. Every detail was designed to impress, from the impeccably dressed waitstaff to the discreet classical music wafting through the air. Sarah stepped inside, her arm linked with William's as they entered. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with that of delicate cuisine, creating an atmosphere that was both enchanting and intimidating. William was composed as ever, his dark suit tailored to perfection, exuding a confidence that bordered on detachment. Beside him, Sarah felt like a fragile figure in a world of unshakable giants, but she steeled herself, her fingers tightening ever so slightly on his arm. Remember, William murmured as they approached the private dining room. You're here as my fiancé, not a strategist. Smile, nod, and let them lead the conversation. Got it, Sarah replied, forcing a tight smile. Her pulse raced beneath the polished exterior, but she was determined not to falter. She'd come too far to let her nerves betray her. The private room was already abuzz with conversation when they arrived. A dozen influential figures sat around the long, elegantly set table, their laughter and chatter filling the space. At the head of the table sat Charles Wentworth, a man whose grey hair and sharp eyes spoke of decades of dominance in the business world. Beside him was Harriet Hargrove, William's mother, her regal posture a stark contrast to the warmth that her son seemed to lack. As William and Sarah entered, the room hushed slightly, all eyes turned to them, some curious, others appraising. William's hand rested lightly on Sarah's back as he guided her forward. "Charles," William said with his signature polished tone. "Harriet, everyone, I'd like you to meet Sarah, my fiancée." A ripple of interest passed through the room. Sarah met their gazes with as much composure as she could muster, her practiced smile firmly in place. Charles rose, extending a hand to her. "Sarah," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "Welcome. It's a pleasure to finally meet the woman who's managed to capture William's attention." Sarah shook his hand, her grip firm despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Thank you, Mr. Wentworth. It's an honor to be here." Harriet's gaze, however, was less welcoming. Her icy eyes swept over Sarah like a scan for imperfections, and her lips tightened into a polite but distant smile. "Indeed. Welcome." As they took their seats, Sarah found herself between William and Charles. The conversation quickly returned to business, with discussions of market strategies, international expansions, and projected profits dominating the table. Sarah listened intently, careful not to interject unless spoken to directly. It wasn't long before Charles turned to her, his curiosity clearly piqued. "So, Sarah," he began, his tone casual but probing. "William tells me you have a background in administration. What do you think of our plans for European expansion?" Sarah hesitated for a heartbeat, her mind racing. She could hear Eleanor's voice warning her to stay in her lane, but this wasn't just about keeping up appearances. It was about proving she could hold her own in a room full of power players. "I think the expansion is a bold move," she said carefully, her voice steady. "But boldness alone isn't enough. Ensuring that you understand the cultural and economic nuances of each market will be key. For instance, in Germany, there's a strong emphasis on long-term partnerships rather than quick gains. Building trust there might take longer, but the payoff could be far greater." A brief silence fell over the table. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she met Charles's gaze, unsure of how her words would land. Then, to her surprise, he chuckled. "Interesting perspective," he said, nodding. "You've given this some thought." William glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Approval, perhaps, or maybe just surprise. The rest of the evening unfolded more smoothly than Sarah had dared to hope. She answered questions when asked, laughed at the appropriate moments, and navigated the social undercurrents with a grace she hadn't known she possessed. Even Harriet's sharp gaze seemed to soften slightly, though her approval remained elusive. As dessert was served, a rich chocolate soufflé that seemed too beautiful to eat, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had survived the evening, and not just survived, she had contributed. The doubts that had plagued her leading up to this moment felt smaller now, less insurmountable. As the dinner concluded, William rose, thanking everyone for their attendance. Sarah followed his lead, offering her own gratitude before excusing herself. The cool night air outside the restaurant was a welcome relief after the intensity of the evening. In the car ride back to his penthouse, the silence between them was charged. William finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "You handled yourself well tonight." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her tone guarded. She glanced at him, searching his face for any hint of what he truly thought. "Was it convincing enough?" "It was," he said simply, his gaze fixed ahead. After a moment he added, "But don't get too comfortable. Tonight was just the beginning." The words stung slightly, but Sarah nodded, her resolve unshaken. "I wasn't planning on getting comfortable." As the car glided through the city streets, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Whatever lay ahead, She had proven tonight that she could face it. The world William inhabited might be foreign and daunting, but she was learning to navigate it, one step at a time. The morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows of William's penthouse, illuminating the city below in a muted glow. William stood by the window, a cup of black coffee in hand, his thoughts still tangled in the events of the previous night. He had replayed every moment, every glance and word exchanged during the dinner. Despite his meticulous planning, Sarah's performance had exceeded his expectations. She had not only managed to keep pace with the room, but had also impressed Charles Wentworth, a rare feat. He frowned slightly, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Sarah's insights about the European expansion had been sharp and perceptive, and though he wouldn't admit it aloud, her contribution had been instrumental. But what unsettled him wasn't her skill. It was the way she had done it. With a quiet confidence, she had navigated the evening without losing herself, and for the first time in a long while, William found himself curious about someone beyond their utility. The chime of the elevator broke his reverie. Eleanor stepped into the living room, carrying her ever-present tablet. Her sharp eyes immediately assessed William's contemplative stance. "Good morning," she said briskly, setting the tablet on the glass coffee table. "You look deep in thought." "I assume the dinner went well. Better than I anticipated," William replied, his tone measured. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Sarah handled herself with surprising competence. Competence? Eleanor arched a brow, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "That's high praise coming from you." William ignored the remark, his mind shifting to practical matters. "We need to prepare for what comes next. The board will expect Sarah to attend more events." Charles, in particular, seemed keen on her presence. Eleanor nodded, tapping notes into her tablet. "I assumed as much. I've already started drafting a schedule for additional training sessions. But I'd suggest you consider the personal dynamics here, and William. Sarah's not a corporate accessory. You'd do well to acknowledge her individuality." William's jaw tightened slightly, but he gave a curt nod. "I'll keep that in mind." Across the city, Sarah stood in the tiny kitchen of her Brooklyn apartment, staring blankly at the steaming cup of tea in her hands. The events of the previous night felt surreal, like a vivid dream she couldn't shake. She had walked into that dinner as an outsider, and yet, by the end of it, she had held her own in a room full of powerful strangers. Emily bustled into the kitchen, her nursing textbooks tucked under one arm. She paused, noticing Sarah's distant expression. "You okay? You've been staring at that tea for 10 minutes. Sarah blinked, a small smile breaking through her thoughts. "I'm fine, just processing." Emily set her books down and slid into the seat across from her sister. "The big fancy dinner went okay, then?" "It did," Sarah admitted, her tone tinged with disbelief. "I didn't trip, spill anything, or insult anyone, so I'd call it a win." Emily laughed, but her gaze softened with curiosity. "And William, what's he like when he's not all businessman-y?" Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words. "He's complicated, polished, controlled, but there's something underneath all that. I can't quite figure him out." Emily leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand. "Sounds like he's more than just a paycheck." "Don't start," Sarah warned, though her tone was more amused than stern. "This is a job, Em. Nothing more." "Sure," Emily replied, her grin teasing. "But jobs don't usually leave you staring into space like you're solving the mysteries of the universe." Sarah rolled her eyes, but couldn't help laughing. "You're impossible." The conversation lightened, but Emily's words lingered in Sarah's mind. She wasn't sure why William occupied so much of her thoughts, and the realization unsettled her. She had signed up for this arrangement to help her family, not to get entangled in emotions she couldn't afford. Later that afternoon, Sarah received a text from Eleanor, summoning her to the penthouse for a debrief. When she arrived, she found William seated at the dining table, reviewing documents with a practiced efficiency. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral but his gaze steady. "Sarah," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "We need to discuss last night." She sat across from him, her posture composed. "I assume everything went as planned." "It did," William confirmed, leaning back slightly, "but Charles was particularly impressed. He suggested you join the next strategic meeting to offer perspectives." Sarah's brows lifted in surprise. "I thought I was just here to smile and nod." William's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. "Evidently, you're more useful than that." She couldn't help but smirk. "I'll take that as a compliment." Eleanor entered then, placing a file on the table. "We've scheduled additional training sessions to prepare Sarah for future events. You'll also need to refine your understanding of the company's operations. The board is beginning to see you as an asset, and we can't risk any missteps." As Eleanor laid out the plan, Sarah caught William watching her. There was something in his gaze, curiosity perhaps, or a hint of respect, that made her pulse quicken. She forced herself to focus, pushing aside the flutter of emotions that threatened to distract her. When the meeting concluded, William walked her to the elevator. The silence between them was comfortable, but charged with unspoken thoughts. As the elevator doors opened, William hesitated before speaking. "You've surprised me, Sarah," he said, his tone softer than usual. "In a good way." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm full of surprises, William. You'll just have to keep up." The doors closed, and as the elevator descended, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. For the first time since this arrangement began, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, a connection, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Whatever it was, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The clinking of cutlery and the gentle hum of voices filled the private dining room, but William Hargrove's mind was elsewhere. Seated at the head of the table, he glanced down the length of it, his eyes landing on Sarah. She was engaged in polite conversation with Eleanor, her expressions shifting seamlessly between interest and amusement. She was adaptable, he thought, almost unnervingly so. Her presence had been requested for this informal luncheon with a few of the company's key international partners, and to his relief, she had agreed, though not without her characteristic dry wit. Now, watching her navigate the subtle complexities of the gathering, William realized just how effortlessly she was beginning to fit into his world. Too effortlessly, perhaps. "William?" Charles Wentworth's deep voice broke through his thoughts. The older man leaned slightly forward, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've been uncharacteristically quiet today. Could it be that you're finally allowing someone else to steal the spotlight?" William's lips twitched into a faint smile, though his eyes remained guarded. "Hardly, Charles. I'm simply appreciating how smoothly things are progressing." Charles followed William's gaze to Sarah, his expression thoughtful. "She's a remarkable woman, sharp, composed, and with just enough mystery to keep things interesting." "You've chosen well." William stiffened at the word chosen, but he masked it quickly. "Sarah is unique," he conceded. "Carefully neutral." Charles chuckled, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Don't let her go unnoticed, my boy. A woman like that can elevate more than a man's image. She can elevate his life." The older man's words hung in the air, but William dismissed them with a subtle shift in posture. His life, he reminded himself, was built on control and precision, not emotion. And yet, as the luncheon concluded and the guests dispersed, William found himself lingering in the dining room, his thoughts drifting unbidden to the woman who had so unexpectedly become integral to his plans. Sarah stood on the terrace of the Hargrove Enterprises building, the brisk autumn air brushing against her skin. The luncheon had been a success, and while she felt a quiet pride in her performance, she also felt the weight of maintaining the facade. Each interaction demanded energy, every word carefully chosen to reflect a role that still felt foreign. "Penny for your thoughts." William's voice cut through the quiet, startling her. She turned to see him approaching, his tie slightly loosened, a rare hint of informality in his otherwise pristine demeanor. He stopped a few steps away, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. "Just taking a moment to breathe," she replied, offering a faint smile. "It's a lot to take in." He nodded, his gaze steady. "You handled yourself well today. Better than I expected." Another glowing review from the ever-demanding Mr. Hargrove. She teased lightly, earning the slightest twitch of his lips. "Should I start framing these compliments?" "Perhaps," he replied, his tone dry but not unkind. After a beat, he added, "You've been invited to the upcoming strategy meeting." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. Invited or summoned? William allowed himself a small smirk. "A bit of both. Charles was particularly insistent. He seems to think your perspective is invaluable." She tilted her head, studying him. "And you? What do you think?" For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of her question evident in the way his jaw tightened. "I think," he said slowly, "that you've proven yourself capable. But these meetings are different. They're not about appearances. They're about substance. You'll need to be prepared." Her lips curved into a wry smile. "I don't recall agreeing to become your business consultant." "Think of it as an extension of the arrangement," he countered, his tone even. "You've already exceeded expectations in every other area." She considered his words, the challenge implicit in them. "All right," she said finally. "But if I'm going to sit in on strategy meetings, I'll need to know more. About the company, about you." William's expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or wariness. "Fair enough. We'll set up a briefing." She nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the cityscape. "You know, for someone who claims to have everything under control, you're surprisingly open to improvisation." His gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. Sometimes control is knowing when to adapt. Later that week, Sarah found herself in a sleek conference room, seated at the long, polished table alongside William and his senior executives. The atmosphere was tense but focused, the air thick with the weight of important decisions. As the discussion progressed, Sarah listened intently, her notepad filled with quick observations. When Charles turned to her, asking for her input on a contentious proposal, she hesitated for only a moment before speaking. Her insights, though offered with humility, sparked a lively debate among the executives. When the meeting concluded, William lingered as the others filed out. He turned to Sarah, his expression unreadable. "You spoke well," he said, his tone devoid of the usual edge. "It's rare to see Charles so thoroughly engaged." "Is that your version of a compliment?" she asked, her lips twitching into a faint smile. He didn't answer directly, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze, respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You're proving to be a valuable asset, Sarah." She met his eyes, her voice steady. "I'm not just here to be an asset, William. I'm here to hold up my end of the deal, and so far, I think I've done that." For a moment, they stood in silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then, with a faint nod, William gestured toward the door. "Let's see if you can keep it up," he said, his voice tinged with a challenge. As Sarah walked out of the conference room, her head held high, she couldn't help but feel that the dynamic between them was shifting, slowly but undeniably. The car's engine purred softly as it rolled to a stop in front of a modest brownstone on a quiet Brooklyn street. William Hargrove leaned back in his seat, his sharp eyes scanning the neighborhood. It was a far cry from the polished skyscrapers and high-end restaurants of Manhattan, but there was an undeniable charm to the scene, a kind of warmth and authenticity he rarely encountered in his carefully controlled world. Sarah sat beside him, clutching her purse. Her fingers tapped lightly against the worn leather, a nervous rhythm that betrayed her otherwise composed demeanor. She had resisted this visit, but William's insistence had worn her down. Now, as they sat parked in front of her apartment building, she wondered if she had made a mistake. "This is where you live?" William asked, his tone more curious than judgmental. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "Not everyone has a penthouse overlooking the city." William's lips twitched, a fleeting hint of amusement crossing his face. "I wasn't criticizing. It's different." "Different isn't bad," Sarah said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "But I don't expect you to understand." William opened his door, stepping out before she could protest. She sighed, following him onto the sidewalk. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of baked goods from a nearby cafe, mingling with the sound of children playing a few doors down. As they climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sarah hesitated at the door. "This isn't your world, William," she said softly, turning to face him. "You don't have to come in." "I want to," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If I'm asking you to navigate mine, it's only fair I see yours." Reluctantly, Sarah unlocked the door and pushed it open. The apartment was small but cozy, every inch reflecting her and Emily's personalities. Books lined mismatched shelves, their spines worn from frequent use. A soft, slightly faded couch sat in the center of the living room, draped with a knitted throw that Sarah's mother had made years ago. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. "Sarah?" Emily's voice called from the kitchen, followed by the sound of clattering dishes. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening when she saw William. "Oh, hi. I wasn't expecting company." "Emily, this is William," Sarah said, her voice tinged with embarrassment. "William, my sister." Emily wiped her hands on a towel, her expression equal parts curiosity and caution. "Nice to meet you." "And you," William replied, extending a hand. His handshake was firm but not overly formal, a subtle gesture that seemed to put Emily at ease. "Do you want some coffee?" Emily offered, gesturing toward the kitchen. "It's not fancy, but it's strong." William glanced at Sarah, who shrugged, then nodded. Coffee would be fine. As Emily busied herself in the kitchen, Sarah motioned for William to sit. He chose the armchair, his sharp eyes taking in the details of the room. His gaze lingered on a framed photo on the side table, a younger Sarah and Emily smiling broadly, their arms wrapped around their mother. "She looks like you," William said, nodding toward the picture. Sarah followed his gaze, her expression softening. "That's our mom. She's the reason I'm doing all this." William's brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing, sensing there was more to the story. Before he could press further, Emily returned with 2 mugs of coffee and set them on the table. "It's not exactly the high-end stuff you're used to," Emily said with a grin, "but it'll wake you up." William took a sip, his expression neutral. "It's good, thank you." Emily plopped onto the couch, her gaze darting between her sister and William. "So, Sarah tells me you're a big-shot CEO. Must be nice, running the world." William chuckled softly, his first genuine laugh of the evening. "It's less glamorous than it sounds, but it keeps me busy." "And you keep Sarah busy," Emily teased, nudging her sister. "She's been running around like a headless chicken lately." "Emily," Sarah warned, though her tone was more exasperated than angry. "It's true," Emily said with a grin, "but I get it." You've got big shoes to fill. She's doing more than that, William said, his voice carrying a rare warmth. Your sister's been invaluable. Emily's grin softened into a proud smile, and Sarah looked away, suddenly self-conscious. She wasn't used to praise, least of all from William. The evening wore on, and to Sarah's surprise, the conversation flowed easily. William asked Emily about her nursing studies, listening intently as she described her passion for helping others. For a man who lived in a world of mergers and acquisitions, he seemed genuinely interested in the challenges of hospital life. As the clock ticked past 9, William rose, thanking Emily for the coffee. Sarah walked him to the door, the cool air from the hallway brushing against her skin. "Thank you," William said quietly, his tone uncharacteristically soft. "For what?" Sarah asked, puzzled. "For letting me see this," he said, gesturing toward the apartment. "It's grounding." Sarah studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of condescension, but found none. "You're welcome. Just don't get used to it." A faint smile crossed his lips as he stepped into the hallway. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, William." As the door clicked shut, Sarah leaned against it, her thoughts swirling. She had let him into her world, and somehow it hadn't been a disaster. If anything, it had felt natural, and that realization terrified her more than she cared to admit. The sound of footsteps on polished marble echoed faintly as Sarah stepped into the grand atrium of Hargrove Enterprises. The light streaming through the vast windows cast geometric patterns across the floor, but Sarah barely noticed. Today's meeting felt different. The stakes were higher, and so was her awareness of the watchful eyes around her. "Miss Thompson!" a voice called out. Eleanor appeared, her presence as crisp and efficient as ever. "Good, you're on time. Follow me." Sarah fell into step beside her, clutching a portfolio William had insisted she bring. She glanced at Eleanor, searching for reassurance. "How intense is this meeting going to be?" "Intense enough," Eleanor replied, not breaking stride. "Harriet will be there." Sarah's heart sank. She had met William's mother briefly at the dinner, but their interaction had been cordial at best. Harriet Hargrove radiated an aura of icy authority, and Sarah wasn't blind to the woman's reservations about her. "Any advice?" Sarah asked, trying to mask her nerves. Eleanor gave her a sidelong glance. "Don't flinch." The conference room was already filling when they arrived. Executives in tailored suits mingled around the table, their low voices carrying an undercurrent of anticipation. At the head of the table sat Harriet, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. William stood beside her, reviewing a document with Charles Wentworth. As Sarah entered, the conversations quieted momentarily, eyes flickering toward her. She felt the weight of their scrutiny but lifted her chin, determined not to falter. "Sarah," William said, his tone professional but tinged with something softer. "Take a seat next to Charles." She moved to her spot, the room's attention slowly shifting back to the meeting's agenda. Harriet's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary before she turned her focus to the document in front of her. The meeting began with updates on ongoing projects, discussions of market strategies, and detailed analyses of upcoming ventures. Sarah listened intently, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. When the conversation shifted to the European expansion, Charles turned to her. "Sarah, you had some interesting thoughts on this during our last discussion," he said. "Care to elaborate?" Her pulse quickened, but she steadied herself. This was her moment to prove that she belonged here. Clearing her throat, she began, "The strategy you've outlined is comprehensive, but there's an opportunity to deepen partnerships by leveraging localized talent. It's not just about entering a market, it's about understanding the culture and building trust." As she spoke, the room grew quieter, the executives leaning in to listen. Even Harriet, who had appeared disinterested, seemed to be paying attention. Sarah finished her points, glancing briefly at William. His expression was neutral, but his eyes held a glimmer of approval. "That's an intriguing perspective," Charles said, nodding. "We'll need to explore that further." The meeting continued, but the tension Sarah had felt earlier began to dissipate. She had held her own, and though she was still an outsider, she could feel the beginnings of acceptance. After the meeting, the executives filtered out, their discussions carrying on in pairs and small groups. Harriet remained seated, her sharp eyes fixed on Sarah. William lingered near the door, watching the interaction unfold. "Miss Thompson," Harriet said finally, her voice as cool as ever. "May I have a word?" Sarah hesitated but nodded, moving to sit across from her. Harriet regarded her with the practiced scrutiny of someone accustomed to reading people like books. "You spoke well today," Harriet began, though her tone was far from warm. "You're intelligent." "I'll give you that." "Thank you," Sarah replied, unsure where this was leading. "But intelligence isn't everything," Harriet continued, her gaze piercing. "William's world is ruthless. It demands more than sharp ideas. It demands resilience, loyalty, and an unshakable understanding of your place." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah met Harriet's gaze, refusing to look away. "I understand what's expected of me, Mrs. Hargrove. And I know my place better than anyone." Harriet's lips tightened into something resembling a smile. Let's hope you can prove that." With that, she rose gracefully, leaving Sarah to sit in the echo of her words. William approached, his expression unreadable. "Don't let her get to you," he said quietly. "She doesn't intimidate me," Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed a hint of frustration. "She's just protective." William chuckled softly. A rare sound. "That's one way to put it." As they exited the conference room together, William paused. "You impressed them today, even Harriet, though she'll never admit it." Sarah glanced at him, her confidence returning. "I guess I'll take that as a win." "You should," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've earned it." That evening, Sarah returned to her Brooklyn apartment, the day's events replaying in her mind. Emily was sprawled on the couch, her textbooks spread out before her. "How was the big meeting?" Emily asked, looking up. "Intense," Sarah admitted, sinking into the armchair. "But I held my own." Emily grinned. "Of course you did. You're a force to be reckoned with." Sarah smiled, but her thoughts drifted to Harriet's words. She had stepped into William's world and was starting to find her footing, but the pressures were mounting. The lines between her role and reality were blurring, and she wasn't sure where it would all lead. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of pride. She had faced the pressures of society, and she hadn't flinched. The resort was nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, a picturesque escape far removed from the noise and intensity of the city. Sarah had barely slept the night before, the looming weight of this overnight trip sitting heavily on her shoulders. It was meant to be an evaluation, a first-hand look at one of Hargrove Enterprises' properties that William was considering hosting a major corporate retreat. But Sarah suspected there was more to the excursion than he had let on. The sleek town car glided along the gravel driveway, coming to a stop before the resort's main lodge. William was already out of the car, his posture as precise as ever, scanning the grounds like a general assessing his territory. Sarah stepped out behind him, her hands gripping her coat tightly against the crisp autumn air. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, taking in the sprawling property. The lodge, with its rustic charm and modern touches, stood against a backdrop of fiery orange and red trees. A lake shimmered in the distance, the surface smooth as glass. William glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "Let's see if it meets expectations." Inside, the lodge was warm and inviting, with high vaulted ceilings, crackling fireplaces, and the faint scent of cedarwood. The resort manager, a middle-aged woman named Donna, greeted them with a practiced smile and a firm handshake. She led them on a tour of the property, highlighting its amenities and potential as a venue for high-profile corporate gatherings. As they walked, Sarah noticed William's demeanor shift. His questions were pointed, his tone brisk, his critical eye missing nothing. It was a side of him she had grown used to, but still found exhausting. "This is the ballroom," Donna explained, pushing open a set of ornate double doors. The space was grand, yet understated, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the lake. "It can accommodate up to 200 guests." William nodded thoughtfully. "And the acoustics? They're excellent," Donna replied, unfazed by his intensity. "We've hosted orchestras and keynote speakers here without issue." Sarah hung back slightly, watching the exchange. While William scrutinized every detail, she allowed herself to take in the view. The lake's stillness seemed to call to her, its quiet beauty a stark contrast to the noise of her current life. "Sarah," William's voice pulled her back. She turned to see him watching her, his brows slightly furrowed. "What do you think?" She blinked, surprised he was asking her opinion. "It's impressive. The setting feels intimate but still grand, and the view is breathtaking. If the goal is to create a memorable experience, this place certainly has the potential." William studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Noted." After the tour, Donna left them to settle into their respective suites. Sarah's room was cozy and luxurious, with a fireplace, a plush armchair by the window, and a small terrace overlooking the lake. She unpacked her things mechanically, her thoughts drifting to the dynamic that had been quietly evolving between her and William. He remained as guarded as ever, but she had started to glimpse moments of vulnerability, small cracks in his armor that made her wonder what lay beneath. That evening, they met for dinner in the lodge's private dining room. The meal was exquisite, though Sarah barely tasted it. The conversation was polite but superficial, both of them skirting around deeper topics. It wasn't until after dessert, when William suggested a walk, that the atmosphere began to shift. The night was cool but clear, the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. They strolled along the edge of the lake, the only sounds the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "You're quiet tonight," William observed, his tone less formal than usual. "I'm just taking it all in," Sarah replied, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. She glanced at him, her curiosity getting the better of her. "What about you? Do you ever stop thinking about work?" He chuckled softly, the sound surprising her. "Not often. That's what I thought," she said, a teasing note in her voice. "You should try it sometime. You might find it refreshing." He smirked, though there was a hint of self-awareness in his expression. "And what would I do instead?" "I don't know," Sarah said, shrugging. "Something that makes you happy." William stopped walking, turning to face her. His gaze was intense, but there was something vulnerable in it as well. "What makes you think I'm not happy?" She met his eyes, unflinching. "Because I've never seen you look like you are." The words hung between them, the night suddenly feeling heavier. For a moment, William seemed as if he might say something, but he turned away, his jaw tightening. They continued walking in silence, the mood subdued. When they returned to the lodge, Sarah lingered by the fireplace in the common room, while William disappeared into his suite. She stared into the flames, her thoughts swirling. She had always believed she understood what drove him: power, control, ambition, but tonight had revealed a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite name. As she climbed into bed later that night, the stillness of the resort seemed to press in around her. She was starting to see William in ways she hadn't expected, and that realization both intrigued and unsettled her. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, nothing more, and yet the lines were beginning to blur. The lake shimmered faintly in the moonlight, its surface rippling gently as a breeze swept across it. Sarah watched from her window, her breath fogging the glass. She had a feeling that, like the lake, her relationship with William was on the verge of being stirred in ways she couldn't yet predict. The early morning fog clung to the lake, softening the sharp edges of the surrounding hills. Sarah stood on the small terrace outside her suite, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The quiet of the resort, far removed from the constant hum of the city, had an oddly grounding effect, yet her mind was anything but calm. The previous evening's walk with William lingered in her thoughts. His vulnerability, however fleeting, had shifted something between them. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her. Setting her mug down, she picked it up to find a message from Emily. "How's the fancy retreat? Don't forget to bring me back a souvenir." Sarah smiled, the simplicity of her sister's humor a welcome reprieve. She typed a quick reply, promising to find something small but thoughtful. As she set the phone down, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, William stood on the other side, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. He held 2 cups of coffee, extending one to her without a word. "Good morning to you too," Sarah said, taking the cup with a raised brow. "Do you always start your day this early?" "Habits of a lifetime," he replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes briefly scanned the room, as though cataloguing its details. "Are you ready for the site review?" "Just about," Sarah said, motioning toward the chair where her coat lay. "But something tells me you didn't come here just to check on my punctuality." William's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "You're perceptive." She crossed her arms, leaning casually against the table. "So, what is it?" He hesitated, a rare crack in his otherwise unflappable demeanor. "There's something I wanted to talk about before we head out." Sarah straightened slightly, the weight in his tone putting her on alert. "All right, what is it?" William moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out over the foggy lake. "Last night, you asked me if I was happy." She blinked, surprised he was bringing it up. "And—" "It's not a question I'm used to answering," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "Or even thinking about—" Sarah waited, sensing he wasn't finished. When he turned back to face her, his expression was more open than she had ever seen it. "My father died when I was 22, he said abruptly, the words dropping into the silence like stones. It wasn't unexpected. He'd been sick for years, but when it happened, everything shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't just a son. I was the head of the family, responsible for the company, the employees, and the legacy he left behind." The confession caught Sarah off guard, and she found herself leaning forward, her curiosity tinged with empathy. "That's a lot to take on at such a young age." "It was," he said, his tone almost detached, as though recounting someone else's story. "But there wasn't time to think about it. My mother, Harriet, made sure of that. She pushed me, reminded me every day of what was at stake. Failure wasn't an option." Sarah thought of Harriet's piercing gaze, the unrelenting pressure she had seen in the woman's every word and action. It wasn't hard to imagine the weight she had placed on William's shoulders. "And what about what you wanted?" Sarah asked softly. William's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting away. "It didn't matter. What mattered was preserving what my father built." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling between them. Sarah struggled to find the right response, her usual sharp wit subdued by the rawness of his confession. "You've spent your whole life living for someone else's expectations," she said finally, her voice careful. "Maybe it's time you started thinking about your own." William looked at her then, something flickering in his eyes that she couldn't quite read. And what would that look like? The vulnerability in his question took her breath away, and for a moment she forgot the lines they were supposed to be following, the arrangement, the roles, the unspoken rules. She stepped closer, her voice steady but gentle. "I don't know, William," she said, "but maybe it's worth finding out." The air between them shifted, heavy with something unspoken. William's gaze lingered on hers, the guarded walls he kept so carefully in place beginning to crack. But before either of them could say anything more, there was another knock at the door. It was Donna, the resort manager, her professional smile firmly in place. "Mr. Hargrove, Ms. Thompson, the car is ready whenever you are." William straightened, his composure returning like a shield, snapping into place. "We'll be down in a moment." Donna nodded and disappeared, leaving Sarah and William alone again. The moment they had shared was gone, replaced by the familiar distance he so often maintained. "Thank you for sharing that," Sarah said, her tone sincere. "I mean it." William nodded curtly, his expression once again unreadable. "Let's get to work." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, inspections, and discussions about the resort's potential. Sarah played her part flawlessly, offering insights when appropriate and deferring to William's authority when necessary. But the memory of their earlier conversation stayed with her, a quiet reminder that there was more to him than the polished exterior he presented to the world. That evening, as she sat by the fire in the lodge's common room, she found herself reflecting on her own past, the sacrifices she had made, the responsibilities she had shouldered. In many ways, she and William were not so different. Both of them were driven by duty, shaped by loss, and searching for something they couldn't quite define. The thought both comforted and unsettled her. Because if she was starting to see him in a new light, what did that mean for the carefully constructed walls she had built around her own heart? The journey back to Manhattan was cloaked in an unusual silence. The rhythmic hum of the car's engine filled the space between William and Sarah, who sat on opposite ends of the back seat, their thoughts seemingly miles apart. Outside, the city skyline grew larger, its towering buildings rising like steel sentinels against the grey horizon. But Sarah's focus remained inward, replaying William's earlier confession in her mind. Her gaze flicked to him briefly. He was staring out the window, his profile sharp and unreadable. For someone who lived his life in a world of precision and control, he had revealed something profoundly human, a wound that success and power could not fully heal. And in doing so, he had stirred something within her, a compassion she wasn't sure she could afford. "You're awfully quiet," she said finally, her voice breaking the stillness. William turned, his eyes meeting hers. "So are you." "I'm processing," she admitted, leaning back against the leather seat. "You don't drop personal revelations often. It's a lot to take in." He smirked faintly, though there was no humor in his expression. "I suppose I'm not known for oversharing." "No," Sarah said, her tone softening, "but maybe you should try it more often. You might find it liberating." His brow arched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his attention back to the passing scenery, his expression thoughtful. When they arrived at the Hargrove Enterprises building, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. The doorman greeted William with the usual deference, and Sarah followed him through the lobby, the buzz of corporate life, a stark contrast to the quiet introspection of the drive. As they stepped into the private elevator, William broke the silence. "I have a meeting with the board this afternoon. Eleanor will brief you on upcoming appearances." Sarah nodded, biting back a retort. His abrupt return to business as usual felt jarring after the vulnerability he had shown earlier, but she reminded herself that this was his default setting, practical, detached, and always moving forward. "Got it?" she said, forcing a neutral tone. The elevator doors opened, and William stepped out, leaving her with a nod that felt more like a dismissal than a goodbye. As the doors slid shut again, Sarah exhaled slowly, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her Brooklyn apartment, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. Emily was sprawled on the couch, a textbook open in front of her, but her attention kept drifting to her sister. "All right," Emily said, finally breaking the silence. "What's going on?" Sarah looked up, startled. "What do you mean? You've been staring at that mug for 10 minutes, and you've barely said a word since you got home," Emily said, closing her book. "Spill it." Sarah hesitated, unsure how to explain the complicated tangle of emotions she was feeling. "It's William." Emily's brows lifted. "Oh, Mr. Suit finally showed a crack in the armor." "Something like that," Sarah admitted, her voice quiet. She recounted their conversation at the resort, the way he had opened up about his father and the pressure he had carried for years. Emily listened intently, her expression softening. "Sounds like he's human after all." "He is," Sarah said, her tone almost wistful. "But he's so used to hiding it. It's like he's afraid to let anyone see who he really is." Emily studied her sister for a moment before leaning forward. "And how do you feel about that?" Sarah sighed, setting her mug down. "I don't know. This was supposed to be a job, Em, a way to help Mom and keep us afloat. But the more time I spend with him, the harder it is to keep it all separate." Emily's gaze softened. "Maybe it's not about keeping it separate. Maybe it's about figuring out what's real and what's not." Sarah shook her head, her frustration evident. "That's the problem. I don't know what's real anymore." Emily reached across the table, squeezing her sister's hand. "Whatever it is, you'll figure it out. You always do." The next day, Sarah arrived at the office for another briefing with Eleanor. The older woman was her usual efficient self, reviewing the upcoming schedule with military precision. But as the meeting wrapped up, Eleanor paused, her gaze sharpening. "You've been making an impression, Sarah," she said, her tone unreadable. Sarah frowned. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. "Depends on who you ask. The board sees you as an asset, Harriet less so." Sarah sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I figured as much." "Don't let it get to you," Eleanor advised. "Harriet is protective of William, sometimes to a fault. She doesn't trust easily, and she's not quick to change her mind." "Great," Sarah muttered. "Just what I needed. Another mountain to climb." Eleanor's smile widened slightly. "If anyone can handle it, it's you. Just don't lose sight of why you're here." Sarah nodded, though Eleanor's words stayed with her long after their meeting ended. She knew why she was here: to help her family, to pay off her mother's medical bills, to secure a future for herself and Emily. But as the lines between her role and her reality continued to blur, she couldn't shake the feeling that her reasons were becoming more complicated. That evening, as she stood on her apartment's small balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Sarah allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. She didn't have all the answers, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted them. Sometimes, she thought, it was enough to simply let the questions linger, waiting for the answers to come in their own time. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed against the evening sky, its grand facade illuminated by soft golden lights. The gala inside was in full swing, a symphony of clinking glasses, hushed laughter, and elegant footsteps on marble floors. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, the fabric of her emerald green gown brushing her ankles as she surveyed the room. She had attended her share of high-profile events since entering William's world, but tonight felt different. This wasn't just another performance, it was a benefit gala sponsored by Hargrove Enterprises, Harriet Hargrove had made it clear that this was a test, an opportunity for Sarah to prove she belonged in the rarefied air of Manhattan's elite. But Harriet's scrutiny wasn't what unsettled Sarah tonight. It was William. He was across the room, deep in conversation with Charles Wentworth and a small circle of executives. His demeanor was as polished as ever, sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. But Sarah's mind kept replaying their conversation at the resort, the crack in his armor that had revealed the man beneath. Tonight, he seemed determined to erase that moment, burying himself in the role of the unshakable CEO. Eleanor appeared at Sarah's side, her eyes scanning the crowd with practiced precision. "You're holding up well," she said, her tone quiet but approving. Sarah smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." Eleanor's gaze shifted to William. "He's been watching you." Sarah blinked, glancing at him. He wasn't looking at her now, but the thought unsettled her. Why would he be? Eleanor smirked. "Because he's human, despite what he wants people to think. You've made an impression, Sarah. More than you realize." Before Sarah could respond, a man approached, a silver-haired philanthropist who had been introduced earlier as one of the evening's key donors. "Ms. Thompson," he said warmly, "I wanted to say how much I enjoyed your remarks earlier. It's refreshing to see someone with a genuine passion for these causes." Sarah smiled, grateful for the compliment. She had delivered a short speech at William's request, highlighting the gala's focus on education and opportunity for underprivileged youth. It had been nerve-wracking, but also rewarding, a reminder of why she had agreed to this arrangement in the first place. "Thank you," she replied. "It's a cause close to my heart." The man nodded, his expression sincere. That much was clear. "Keep it up. You're a breath of fresh air in a room that often feels stale." As he moved on, Sarah turned to Eleanor, who was watching her with a knowing smile. "You're winning them over." "I'm not sure that's what Harriet would say," Sarah muttered. Eleanor's smile faded. "Harriet is complicated. She sees you as a threat, not because of who you are, but because of what you represent." "And what's that?" "Change," Eleanor said simply. "Harriet's world is built on tradition and control. You don't fit neatly into that mold, and it scares her." Sarah sighed, glancing across the room again. William was looking her way now, his gaze steady and unreadable. She felt the weight of it, the unspoken tension between them. "I should mingle," Sarah said, straightening her shoulders. "Go," Eleanor replied. "But remember, you've earned your place here." Later, as the evening wound down, Sarah found herself alone on the museum's terrace. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the stifling heat of the crowded ballroom. She leaned against the stone railing, gazing out at the glittering cityscape. It felt good to breathe, to step away from the charade, even if only for a moment. "Escaping the crowd," William's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into his pockets. He had discarded his usual air of formality, his tie loosened and his jacket unbuttoned. He looked human. "Just needed some air," she replied, her tone cautious. He moved closer, leaning against the railing beside her. For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the city filling the space between them. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said finally. "The speech, the conversations, it was all impressive." "Is that your way of saying I passed Harriet's test?" she asked, her voice edged with sarcasm. William smirked faintly. "Let's just say you exceeded expectations." Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. "That's becoming a theme with you." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "It's not a bad thing." She turned to face him, her curiosity overtaking her caution. "Why are you really here, William?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering away before returning to hers. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Maybe I wanted to see if you were okay. Maybe I needed a break myself." His honesty caught her off guard, and for a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. "It's not easy, is it?" she said finally. "Living up to everyone's expectations." "No," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years of experience. "It's not." They stood there for a while longer, the city lights stretching out before them. Sarah felt the barriers between them shift again, the distance narrowing in ways that both comforted and terrified her. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "For what?" "For being here," he said, his gaze steady. "For making this easier." Sarah's breath caught, and she nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As they turned to head back inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The lines between their roles were blurring, and she wasn't sure they could ever be redrawn. The rain tapped softly against the windows of William's penthouse, the grey sky outside mirroring the quiet tension in the room. Sarah sat on the plush cream couch, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. Across from her, William leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. The remnants of their conversation from the gala lingered in the air, unresolved and weighty. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," William began, his voice breaking the stillness. Sarah looked up, her brows knitting together. "Which part? About expectations?" he said, his gaze steady but tinged with something deeper, uncertainty, perhaps, or self-reflection. "You're right. They've shaped everything I've done, every decision I've made, but lately I've been wondering if it's enough." She studied him, the vulnerability in his tone catching her off guard. "And what do you think?" He hesitated, as though weighing the cost of honesty. "I think I don't know how to want anything else." The admission hung between them, heavy and raw. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy, but also frustration. For all his intelligence and power, William seemed so profoundly lost. "You're allowed to want more," she said softly. "You're allowed to want something for yourself." He shook his head, a faint smirk pulling at his lips, though it lacked any real humor. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" she pressed, leaning forward. "You have the resources, the influence. You could do anything, be anyone you wanted. So why keep holding yourself to a standard that only makes you miserable?" His eyes darkened, his composure slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of irritation. "You make it sound easy, but when your every move is scrutinized, every choice questioned, it's not just about what you want, it's about what you owe." "To who?" Sarah asked, her voice rising slightly. "Your father? Harriet?" "The board. When do you get to owe something to yourself?" William's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might shut her out completely. But then he sighed, the fight draining from his posture. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Sarah leaned back, her own emotions swirling. She wanted to help him, to break through the walls he had spent a lifetime building, but she also knew she couldn't force him to see what he wasn't ready to face. "You're stronger than you think, William," she said quietly. "But you'll never see it if you keep letting other people's expectations define you." He met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "And what about you?" he asked. "Do you follow your own advice?" The question caught her off guard, and she hesitated, the weight of her own choices pressing against her. "I try," she said finally, "but it's not always easy." He nodded, as though recognizing the truth in her words. For a moment, they sat in silence, the rain providing a soft backdrop to their shared contemplation. Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself back at her Brooklyn apartment. The familiar space felt like a refuge after the intensity of her conversation with William, but it also felt smaller somehow, the weight of her dual lives pressing in on her. Emily was at the small kitchen table, her laptop open and papers spread around her. She glanced up as Sarah entered, immediately sensing her mood. "Rough day?" Emily asked, pushing her work aside. Sarah dropped her bag onto a chair and sank into the seat opposite her sister. "Something like that." Emily studied her, her sharp gaze unwavering. "It's him, isn't it?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's complicated. It always is with men like him," Emily said, her tone half joking but underpinned with concern. "What happened?" "We talked," Sarah said, though the word felt inadequate to describe the intensity of their exchange. "Really talked. About his father, his responsibilities, the way he's trapped himself in this life he doesn't even seem to want." "And let me guess," Emily said, leaning back in her chair. "You're trying to save him." Sarah shook her head, though she couldn't deny the truth of her sister's words. "It's not like that. I see so much potential in him, Em. He could do so much good, be so much more, if he'd just let himself." Emily frowned, her concern deepening. "And what about you? What are you getting out of this?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond but faltered, the question striking a chord she wasn't ready to face. "It's not about me," she said finally, though even to her own ears the words rang hollow. Emily reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You're allowed to think about yourself, you know, to want more for your own life." Sarah looked down, her sister's words echoing what she had told William earlier. It was easier to see someone else's path than to navigate her own. That evening, Sarah sat on the couch, a book open in her lap, though her mind was elsewhere. Her phone buzzed beside her, and she picked it up to find a message from William. "Thank you for earlier." She stared at the words, her heart tugging in two directions. There was so much left unsaid between them, so many barriers still in place. But this small gesture felt like a step forward, a crack in the facade he had spent years perfecting. "Any time," she replied, the simplicity of the message belying the complexity of her emotions. As the rain continued to fall outside, Sarah couldn't help but wonder where this path would lead. For better or worse, her life and William's were becoming increasingly intertwined, and the deeper she ventured into his world, the harder it was to imagine stepping back. The Hargrove Enterprises boardroom was a fortress of glass and steel, designed to project strength and power. Yet as Sarah entered alongside William, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. This wasn't just another meeting. Harriet Hargrove had orchestrated this gathering with the precision of a chess master, her intent clear: to tighten her grip on William's world and scrutinize Sarah's presence within it. The board members were already seated, their expressions varying from cordial to calculating. Harriet, as always, sat at the head of the table, her poised demeanor a mask for her unrelenting scrutiny. William gestured for Sarah to take the seat beside him, a silent assurance that he wanted her there, despite whatever storm was brewing. "Thank you all for coming," Harriet began, her voice smooth but firm. "Today's agenda includes updates on the European expansion and a review of our upcoming philanthropic initiatives." Her eyes flicked briefly to Sarah before moving on, as though acknowledging her presence was an obligation rather than a choice. Sarah kept her expression neutral, determined not to let the older woman's frosty demeanor unnerve her. The discussion began with a series of dry presentations, graphs and figures dominating the screens as each department head delivered their updates. Sarah listened intently, her notepad filling with observations. She knew her role was to support William, but she couldn't help noticing areas where her insights might add value. When the conversation shifted to the philanthropic initiatives, a subject Sarah had grown increasingly passionate about, she felt William's gaze on her. He hadn't spoken much during the meeting, his focus seemingly split between the discussions and the tension radiating from Harriet. "Ms. Thompson," Harriet said suddenly, her tone polite but sharp enough to draw every eye in the room. "Since you've been so closely involved in our philanthropic efforts, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on how we might enhance our outreach." The question was a trap, Sarah realized instantly. Harriet wasn't asking for her input. She was challenging her, testing whether she had the depth to back up her presence in this room. Sarah took a breath, steadying herself. "Of course," she began, her voice calm but confident. "One area we might focus on is creating more sustainable partnerships with community organizations. It's not just about writing checks. It's about ensuring that the resources we provide have a lasting impact. For example, in our education initiatives, we could explore mentorship programs that pair executives with students from underserved communities." The room was silent for a moment, the board members exchanging glances. Harriet's expression remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps irritation, perhaps grudging respect. "That's an interesting perspective," Harriet said finally, her tone carefully measured. "We'll take it under advisement." William leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's more than interesting, it's actionable. I think we should move forward with Sarah's suggestion and start identifying potential partners." Harriet's gaze snapped to her son, her composure faltering for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered, nodding once. "If you believe it's worth pursuing, William, then by all means." The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Sarah could feel the undercurrents of power and resistance swirling around her, and while she had held her ground, she knew the battle was far from over. After the meeting, William and Sarah rode the elevator in silence, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on both of them. When they reached his office, William closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling sharply. "You handled that well," he said, his tone laced with both admiration and frustration. "Better than I expected, honestly." Sarah crossed her arms, her irritation bubbling to the surface. "Is that your way of saying you didn't think I could hold my own?" William's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "Not at all. I've learned not to underestimate you." She softened slightly, but refused to let him off the hook entirely. "Your mother, on the other hand, seems determined to find a reason to." His expression darkened, the smirk fading. "Harriet is complicated. She spent her whole life trying to protect what my father built, and she sees anything or anyone she can't control as a threat." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "And what about you? Do you see me as a threat?" William's gaze met hers, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. "No," he said quietly, "I see you as an ally." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For all their differences, there was a growing sense of trust, fragile but undeniable. "Then maybe it's time you reminded Harriet of that," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Because I'm not going anywhere." William studied her for a long moment before nodding, his resolve hardening. "Neither am I." That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment, exhaustion weighing on her. Emily was waiting, her curiosity evident as she took in her sister's weary expression. "Tough day?" Emily asked, setting aside the novel she had been reading. Sarah dropped onto the couch with a groan. "You could say that. Harriet practically dissected me in front of the entire board." Emily winced. "Ouch! Did you survive?" "Barely," Sarah said with a wry smile. "But William backed me up. That was unexpected." Emily arched a brow. "Unexpected how?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how to articulate the shift she had felt between them. "He's starting to trust me. Really trust me." Emily's expression softened, a small smile tugging at her lips. Sounds like progress. Sarah nodded, though a knot of uncertainty still sat in her chest. Progress was one thing, but the deeper she ventured into William's world, the more she wondered if she could navigate the fragile balance between their arrangement and whatever was growing between them. For now, all she could do was move forward, one step at a time. The sound of rain tapped gently against the glass of the expansive windows in William's penthouse, a soothing backdrop to the rising tension inside. Sarah sat across from him at the dining table, a spread of documents and reports between them. The air was thick with unspoken words as they worked side by side, their professional collaboration a thin veneer over the emotional undercurrents that had begun to shape their interactions. "I don't see how this approach works," William said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but edged with frustration as he scanned a page in front of him. "If we invest heavily in the mentorship program without first securing additional corporate partners, the financial strain could—" "It's not just about the money," Sarah interjected, her tone firmer than she intended. "It's about the long-term impact. If we show results now, other partners will see the value and want to join us. Waiting too long makes it look like we're unsure of our own initiatives." William's eyes met hers, sharp but contemplative. "You're confident this will work?" "Yes," she said, leaning forward, "because it's not just numbers, William. It's people, students, families, real lives that we can help. If we treat this like just another transaction, we'll miss the whole point." Her passion caught him off guard, and for a moment the tension between them shifted. There was something in her conviction that made him pause, reconsidering his usual, calculated approach. "All right," he said finally, his voice softening. "Let's try it your way." The admission felt like a small victory, and Sarah allowed herself a faint smile. "You won't regret it." As the conversation moved forward, the mood lightened slightly, but the weight of their earlier intensity lingered. When they wrapped up for the evening, William poured himself a glass of scotch, motioning silently to ask if she wanted one as well. She shook her head, watching as he moved to the windows, his silhouette framed by the glowing cityscape. "You're different," he said suddenly, his back still to her. Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected comment. "Different how?" He turned, the glass in his hand catching the light. "You challenge me. Most people don't." She tilted her head, studying him. "Most people are afraid of you." "And you're not?" he asked, his tone laced with curiosity. "Not anymore," she said, her voice steady. "You're intimidating, sure, but I've seen the man behind the title, and he's not so scary." His lips twitched into a faint smile, but it quickly faded. "That man, he's not as together as you think." Sarah stood, crossing the room to join him by the windows. The city lights stretched endlessly below, a glittering reminder of the world they were trying to navigate together. "No one's as together as they seem," she said. "But you don't have to be, you just have to keep moving forward." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," she admitted, "but it's worth it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared journey pressing against the fragile connection they had built. Then, as if sensing the moment had grown too heavy, William stepped back, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For tonight, for everything." Sarah nodded, sensing the distance he was creating but choosing not to push. "Good night, William." The next morning, Sarah returned to her Brooklyn apartment, eager to recharge after the intensity of the previous evening. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open, a half-empty coffee mug beside her. "Back so soon?" Emily asked, glancing up. "I needed a breather," Sarah said, dropping her bag onto the couch and collapsing beside it. "Last night was a lot." Emily closed her laptop, giving her sister her full attention. "Let me guess, William Sarah nodded, her exhaustion evident. He's letting me in, Em. Slowly, but it's happening, and it's complicated. Emily leaned forward, her expression curious but cautious. Complicated how? It's like there's this wall between us, Sarah said, searching for the right words, but every now and then it cracks, and I can see who he really is. And when that happens, it's hard to remember this is just an arrangement. Emily studied her, her concern evident. You care about him. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. I do. But I can't let that cloud my judgment. There's too much at stake. Emily reached out, squeezing her sister's hand. Just don't lose yourself in all of this, okay? You're allowed to care, but you're also allowed to protect your heart. Sarah nodded, though Emily's words lingered long after their conversation ended. She had stepped into William's world with clear boundaries, but those lines were becoming increasingly blurred, and the more time she spent with him, the harder it was to keep her emotions at bay. That evening, as Sarah prepared for another event with William, she caught herself staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different, more poised, more confident, but also more conflicted. She adjusted the simple but elegant dress Eleanor had chosen for her, smoothing the fabric over her hips as her thoughts churned. When she arrived at the event, a private dinner with key investors, William was already there, his presence commanding as always. But when he saw her, his expression softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. You look perfect, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Sarah smiled, though her heart ached with the weight of everything left unsaid. So do you. As the evening unfolded, they played their roles seamlessly, their partnership a testament to the delicate balance they had achieved. But beneath the surface, the cracks in their armor continued to widen, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. Whether it would bring them closer or tear them apart, she didn't know. All she knew was that she was no longer the same woman who had stepped into this arrangement, and neither was William. The soft glow of the crystal chandeliers reflected in the glasses of champagne as laughter and polite conversation filled the room. It was another high-profile gathering, this time hosted by Hargrove Enterprises to celebrate a recent international partnership. The event had been meticulously planned, from the perfectly curated guest list to the live quartet playing in the corner. But amid the glittering splendor, Sarah felt a distinct tension simmering beneath the surface. William stood near the center of the room, his commanding presence drawing a circle of admirers. He moved through the conversation with his usual ease, the polished charm that always seemed to mask the man underneath. Sarah lingered at the edge of the crowd, nursing a glass of sparkling water and observing him. She could feel the weight of the evening pressing against her, a heaviness that had little to do with the event itself and everything to do with the shifting dynamics between her and William. Miss Thompson, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Harriet Hargrove approached, her elegant black gown accentuating the regal air she carried with her. I see you've taken to observing rather than participating tonight. Sarah smiled politely, unwilling to let Harriet's words rattle her. Sometimes you learn more by listening. Indeed, Harriet said, her tone sharp but civil, though one must also be careful not to fade into the background. I'll keep that in mind, Sarah replied, her voice calm. But I've found that actions speak louder than words. Harriet's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more, her attention shifting to another guest as she glided away. Sarah exhaled quietly, her confidence bolstered by the small victory. Harriet doesn't intimidate you, does she? William's voice came from beside her, startling her slightly. She turned to find him watching her with an expression that bordered on amusement. Not anymore, Sarah admitted, her lips twitching into a faint smile. I've learned that the best way to handle her is to stand my ground." William's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You've become quite good at that." The compliment caught her off guard, but before she could respond, Charles Wentworth approached, his jovial demeanor cutting through the tension. "William, Sarah," Charles said warmly, his glass raised in greeting. "Quite the evening, isn't it?" "Everything seems to be running smoothly," William replied, his tone measured. "And thanks to Sarah, no doubt," Charles said, turning to her. "You've been quite the asset to this company. I dare say some of us are beginning to wonder how we managed without you." Sarah felt a blush creep up her neck at the unexpected praise. "That's kind of you to say, Mr. Wentworth." Charles smiled, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Of course, not everyone shares my sentiment. Harriet, for instance, seems less convinced." "Harriet has her priorities," William interjected smoothly, his tone leaving no room for further discussion. Charles chuckled, raising his glass in a toast before drifting back into the crowd. As he left, William turned to Sarah, his expression darkening. "Don't let him get to you," he said quietly. "Charles likes to stir the pot." "It's fine," Sarah said, though her voice carried a trace of frustration. "I'm used to it." William's gaze softened, but before he could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A journalist, accompanied by a photographer, had slipped past the event staff and was firing questions at the guests. The room tensed as security moved in, but not before a pointed question cut through the air. "Mr. Hargrove, can you confirm the rumors about your fiancée's past? Is it true she was hired through an agency?" The question hit like a thunderclap, and for a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Sarah's breath caught, her heart pounding as every eye turned toward her. She glanced at William, his expression a mask of controlled fury as he stepped forward. "This event is private," he said, his voice cold and authoritative. "You are trespassing." The journalist pressed on, emboldened by the attention. "But isn't it true, Mr. Hargrove? Your relationship is a business arrangement, isn't it?" Before William could respond, Harriet's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The security team finally intervened, escorting the journalist and photographer out of the room, but the damage was done. The murmur of voices grew louder, guests exchanging speculative glances. Sarah felt the weight of their judgment, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. "I need some air," she muttered, slipping away before William could stop her. The terrace was quiet, the cool night air a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom. Sarah gripped the railing, her knuckles white as she tried to steady herself. The accusation hung in her mind, an echo she couldn't silence. The sound of footsteps made her tense. But she didn't turn. She knew it was William before he spoke. "Sarah, is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do they know?" William sighed, stepping closer. It was bound to come out eventually. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "And you didn't think to warn me?" "I didn't expect it to happen tonight," he admitted, his tone defensive. "I thought we had more time." Sarah shook her head, anger and hurt swirling in her chest. "You always think you have control, William. But you can't control this. You can't control people's perceptions or what they'll do with this information." "I can manage it," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let them ruin this." "This?" she echoed, her voice breaking. "What even is this, William? A business arrangement, a lie, or something else?" He opened his mouth to respond but faltered, the truth caught somewhere between his mind and his heart. The silence was deafening. "I can't do this," Sarah whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Not like this." She turned and walked away, leaving William standing alone on the terrace, the city lights reflecting in his eyes as the first real crack in their fragile bond began to show. The subway rumbled beneath Sarah's feet as she sat on a bench at a nearly deserted station, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. The metallic screech of the arriving train pulled her from her thoughts, but she didn't move to board. She couldn't. The night's events replayed in her mind like a broken record, each memory sharper than the last. The journalist's accusations, the gasps from the crowd, and the piercing sting of betrayal in William's silence. She had left the gala in a blur, needing to escape the suffocating weight of scrutiny and the growing realization that she was little more than a pawn in William's carefully constructed world. But now, in the cold, sterile station, the anger had ebbed, leaving behind a hollow ache that she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, the screen lighting up with William's name. She stared at it for a moment before silencing the call. She wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. Back at the penthouse, William paced the living room, his jaw tight and his hands balled into fists at his sides. The city lights sparkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed by Sarah's retreating figure and the damning silence that had settled between them. Eleanor entered the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She set her bag down on the couch, crossing her arms as she studied him. "Well," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind, "are you going to stand there all night, or are you going to do something about this?" "She's not answering my calls," William replied, his voice strained. "I don't even know where she went." Eleanor sighed, her expression softening slightly. "She's hurt, William. And she has every right to be. I didn't plan for this to happen," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I had more time to handle the media, to handle—" "Her?" Eleanor interrupted, arching a brow. "You can't handle people like their business deals. Sarah isn't one of your acquisitions. She's a person who trusted you." William's gaze snapped to hers, his frustration bubbling over. "I know that." "You think I don't know that?" Eleanor held his gaze, unflinching. "Then act like it. If you want to fix this, you need to be honest with her. About everything." He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself, the truth of her words settling in his chest like a stone. With a curt nod, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. When William found Sarah, she was sitting at a small cafe table in the corner of a dimly lit diner, a mug of coffee cooling in front of her. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. "You found me," she said flatly. "I had to," he replied, sliding into the seat across from her. He paused, searching her face for a hint of softness, but found only exhaustion. "Sarah, I'm sorry." Her laugh was bitter, and she shook her head. "You're sorry? For what, exactly? For not telling me the truth? For letting me walk into that room without warning? Or for standing there while they humiliated me?" William flinched at her words, but didn't look away. "For all of it. I didn't handle it the way I should have." "You think?" she shot back, her voice rising slightly. She glanced around the diner, lowering her tone. "You used me, William. I knew that going into this, but somewhere along the way, I thought, I don't know what I thought, that it had become something more." "It has," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "Sarah, it has." She froze, her breath catching as she searched his face for any sign of insincerity. "Then why didn't you fight for me tonight? Why didn't you stand up and say that I'm more than some arrangement?" His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked less like the invincible CEO and more like a man struggling to make sense of his own feelings. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, the words heavy with regret. "Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of losing control, afraid of losing you." Her heart twisted at his confession, but she forced herself to hold firm. Do you even know what you want, William? Because I can't keep doing this, playing a role in a life that doesn't feel real. I want you, he said, his voice raw, not as part of some arrangement, not because the board expects it. I want you because you've made me see the world differently. You've made me see myself differently. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away, shaking her head. You say that now, but what happens when the media digs deeper, when Harriet pushes back even harder? Do I just become another liability for you to manage? You're not a liability, he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. You're the only real thing I've had in years. She stared at him, her resolve wavering as his words sank in. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this man, with all his flaws and fears, could be someone she could trust. But the wounds from the night were still fresh, and she wasn't ready to let them heal just yet. I need time, she said finally, pulling her hand back. Time to figure out what's real for me. William nodded, his eyes filled with an ache that mirrored her own. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. As he stood to leave, Sarah watched him go, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The connection between them was fragile, stretched thin by lies and fear, but as the door closed behind him, she realized that it wasn't broken, not yet. The days that followed were quiet but heavy, the kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like waiting for a storm to pass. Sarah spent most of her time at her Brooklyn apartment, burying herself in small tasks that kept her hands busy, but did little to settle her thoughts. Emily, sensing the weight Sarah carried, gave her space, though she kept a watchful eye, ready to step in if her sister needed her. One evening, as Sarah sat on the couch with a half-finished cup of tea, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, her chest tightening at the sight of William's name. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but curiosity and something deeper urged her to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Sarah?" His tone was careful, as though he were treading on uneven ground. "I just wanted to check on you." "I'm fine," she replied, though the truth was more complicated. "Just taking some time to think." "I understand," he said. There was a pause, the quiet stretching between them like a thin thread. "I miss you." The words hit her harder than she expected, a pang of emotion she wasn't ready to confront. "William?" "I know," he interrupted, his voice tinged with resignation. "I just needed you to know." She didn't respond, unsure of what to say. After a moment, he added, "If you need anything, I'm here." "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. When the call ended, Sarah set her phone down and leaned back against the couch, her thoughts swirling. She had told him she needed time, but the truth was, she wasn't sure how much time would be enough to untangle the emotions she felt. Meanwhile, at Hargrove Enterprises, William threw himself into his work with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Meetings, strategy sessions, and late-night reviews of reports filled his days and nights, leaving little room for anything else. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, his thoughts kept returning to Sarah. Eleanor, ever observant, noticed the change in him. One afternoon, as he sat in his office staring at a report he wasn't reading, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "You're no good to anyone like this," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. William looked up, frowning. "Like what? Distracted, edgy, acting like you can fix everything by throwing yourself into work," she said, crossing her arms. "It's not healthy, and it's not helping." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What do you want me to do, Eleanor? Sit around and mope?" "I want you to figure out what you want and go after it," she said bluntly. "Because right now, you're just running in circles." William stared at her, the truth of her words sinking in. "It's not that simple." "It never is," she replied, her tone softening. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. Her words stayed with him long after she left, a seed of clarity taking root in his mind. A few days later, Sarah decided to visit her mother. The small house in Queens was a stark contrast to the luxury she'd been surrounded by in recent months, but it was a place that grounded her. Margaret Thompson greeted her daughter with a warm smile, though the lines of fatigue on her face betrayed the toll of her illness. "Sarah, it's so good to see you," Margaret said, pulling her into a gentle hug. "You too, Mom," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with relief. Being here felt like taking a deep breath after holding it for too long. They sat in the living room, sipping tea as they caught up. Sarah tried to steer the conversation away from her own life, but her mother's perceptive nature made that impossible. "You're quieter than usual," Margaret observed, her eyes searching Sarah's face. "What's on your mind?" Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "It's complicated. I've been involved with someone, and it's messy." "Messy how?" Margaret asked, her tone patient. "It started as a business arrangement," Sarah admitted, her voice laced with guilt. "But somewhere along the way, it became more, and now, I don't know where we stand." Margaret reached over, taking her daughter's hand. "Love is rarely tidy, Sarah. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful, but if it's real, it's worth fighting for." Sarah blinked, her mother's words hitting her like a wave. "I don't even know if it's love." "Then ask yourself this," Margaret said gently. "When you think about him, do you see a future? Can you imagine a life with him, even when it's not perfect?" Sarah didn't answer immediately, her thoughts racing. She had spent so much time focusing on the challenges of their situation that she hadn't allowed herself to think about what she truly wanted. But as her mother's question lingered, the answer began to take shape in her mind. That night, Sarah sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the city lights in the distance. Her phone lay on the table beside her, William's name still at the top of her recent calls. She picked it up, her fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before dialing. He answered on the first ring. "Sarah?" Her heart clenched at the sound of his voice. "Hi," she said softly. "Can we talk?" "Of course," he said immediately. "When?" "Tomorrow," she replied. "In person?" "I'll be there," he said, his voice steady but filled with hope. As she ended the call, Sarah felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in weeks. Tomorrow, they would talk. Tomorrow, she would finally confront the emotions she had been running from. And tomorrow, perhaps, they would find a way to move forward, together. The cafe was quiet, its morning crowd having dwindled to a few scattered patrons sipping coffee and working on laptops. Sarah sat at a small table near the window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She had arrived early, needing a moment to collect her thoughts before facing William. The sunlight streaming through the window cast a soft glow across the room. But it did little to ease the knot of tension in her chest. When William arrived, he was uncharacteristically casual. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and his tie absent. He looked like a man who had shed some of his armor, though the guarded intensity in his eyes remained. He spotted her immediately and crossed the room with purposeful strides. "Sarah," he said, his voice low as he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." She nodded, unable to trust her voice yet. For a moment, they sat in silence, the noise of the cafe fading into the background. William finally broke the tension. "I owe you more than an apology," he began, his tone earnest. "I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything around me, but I realize now that I can't do that with you. I don't want to." Sarah studied him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his words. "William, I need to know, was any of this real for you? Or was it just another way to manage your image?" He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. It started as a way to manage my image, yes, but it became so much more than that. You became so much more. You made me see things differently, about my life, my choices, myself, and now I can't imagine my world without you in it." Her breath caught at his admission, but she kept her tone steady. "Then why didn't you fight for me? At the gala, when that journalist humiliated me, you stood there and said nothing." He flinched, the memory clearly a painful one. "Because I panicked," he admitted. "For so long, I've been taught to keep everything locked down, to avoid any hint of vulnerability. But that night, I froze, and I hate that I hurt you because of it." Sarah looked down at her tea, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his feelings were genuine, but the walls she had built to protect herself were hard to lower. "You have to understand," she said quietly. "This hasn't been easy for me. Stepping into your world, pretending to be something I'm not, it's taken everything I have. And when it started to feel real, I didn't know what to do with that." William's eyes softened, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know I've asked too much of you, but I'm not asking you to be someone you're not anymore. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are, the woman who challenges me, who sees through all the facades, who makes me want to be better." She swallowed hard, her heart torn between fear and hope. "And what happens when the world doesn't accept that? When people like your mother or the board decide I don't belong?" "They'll have to deal with it," he said firmly, "because this isn't about them. It's about us." Sarah studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. She found none. Instead, she saw a man who was finally willing to take a risk, not just for his company or his reputation, but for her. "I need to know we're on the same page," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "No more lies, no more half-truths. If we do this, it has to be real." "It is real," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. His touch was warm, grounding. "And I'll spend as long as it takes proving that to you." For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. The weight she had been carrying began to lift, though the path ahead was still uncertain. She squeezed his hand, a small but significant gesture. "Then let's take it one step at a time," she said softly. "No expectations, just us." A smile tugged at William's lips, a genuine one that transformed his usually guarded face. "I can do that." The tension between them eased, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. They sat together for a while longer, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, the latest book Sarah was reading, William's favorite childhood memory. The weight of their past struggles lingered, but it no longer felt insurmountable. As they left the cafe, the sunlight felt a little warmer, the air a little lighter. Sarah wasn't sure where this new beginning would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to find out. Later that evening, back in her apartment, Sarah replayed the conversation in her mind. She couldn't deny that William had changed, subtly but undeniably. Whether it was enough, only time would tell. But as she looked out at the city lights, she allowed herself a rare moment of optimism. She was no longer the woman who had stepped into his world unsure of her place. She was stronger now, more certain of what she wanted. And maybe, just maybe, she and William could find a way forward, together, on their own terms. The late afternoon sun bathed Manhattan in a golden hue, the kind of light that softened the edges of even its most intimidating skyscrapers. Sarah sat at her desk in the modest Brooklyn apartment, sorting through bills and correspondence. Though her heart felt lighter after her conversation with William, the reality of her life, of her mother's medical bills and Emily's tuition, remained a constant weight on her shoulders. She looked up from the stack of papers when Emily walked into the room, holding 2 mugs of steaming tea. "I figured you could use this," Emily said, setting one down in front of her sister. "Thanks," Sarah replied, wrapping her hands around the mug and letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "How's the studying going?" "Exhausting, as always," Emily said with a grin, sinking onto the couch. "But enough about me. How are you doing? You seem different, in a good way." Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "William and I talked. Really talked. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page." Emily's expression softened. "That's good, right?" "It is," Sarah said, though her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "But it's also scary. I've been so focused on keeping my guard up, on not letting myself get too attached, that I don't know how to let it down." Emily reached over, placing a reassuring hand on her sister's arm. "It sounds like he's trying, Sarah. And if he's willing to meet you halfway, maybe it's worth the risk." Sarah nodded, the weight of her sister's words settling in her chest. "Maybe." The next day, Sarah met William at a small park nestled in the quieter corners of Manhattan. The park wasn't grand or overly polished, but it had a charm that reminded her of simpler times. Children played on the swings, while couples strolled hand in hand along the pathways. William was already there when she arrived, leaning casually against a bench. He looked more relaxed than she had seen him in weeks, though his eyes still carried the intensity she had come to recognize as his default state. "You're early," Sarah said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I wanted to make sure I didn't miss you," he replied, straightening as she approached. They began walking along the gravel path, their pace unhurried. For a while they didn't speak, the quiet between them comfortable but charged with anticipation. "I've been thinking about what you said," William began, his tone thoughtful, "about taking this one step at a time." "And," Sarah prompted, glancing at him, "I think it's the only way this works," he admitted. "I've spent so much of my life planning everything, trying to control every outcome. But with you, I don't want to control anything. I just want to be present." His honesty took her by surprise, and she stopped walking, turning to face him. "That's not easy for you, is it?" "No," he said, meeting her gaze, "but I'm trying." She searched his face, seeing the effort in his expression, the vulnerability he rarely let anyone see. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress, and for now, that was enough. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice soft. "I really do." They resumed walking, the tension between them easing. As they passed a small pond, William spoke again. "There's something I want to show you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He smiled faintly, his expression tinged with mischief. "You'll see." William led her to a building a few blocks away, a historic structure with arched windows and intricate stonework. Inside, the air was filled with the faint scent of books and aged paper. Sarah realized they were in a small library, its cozy interior lined with shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly. "I thought you might like this," William said, his tone almost shy. "It's one of my favorite places in the city. Quiet, unassuming, and surprisingly, most people don't know it's here." Sarah's heart softened at the gesture. "You brought me to a library." "I figured it would be a better setting than the boardroom," he replied, a hint of humor in his voice. She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "You're full of surprises." They wandered through the aisles, the quiet atmosphere lending itself to an intimacy that didn't require words. As Sarah ran her fingers along the spines of old books, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known she needed. "You said you wanted to take things slow," William said, as they reached a corner where a small reading nook was tucked away. "But I want you to know that I'm here for the long haul, Sarah, whatever it takes." She turned to him, her expression serious but warm. "I believe you, William, and I want to try. But we have to be honest, with each other, with ourselves. No more hiding behind expectations." He nodded, his gaze steady. "Agreed." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of clarity. They weren't perfect, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as they sat together in the quiet corner of the library, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were building something real. That evening, back in her apartment, Sarah reflected on the day. She felt a tentative hope growing within her, one that whispered of possibilities she hadn't dared to dream of before. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. And for now, that was enough. The sharp click of Harriet Hargrove's heels echoed through the penthouse as she entered without knocking, her expression cold and determined. William stood near the bar, pouring himself a glass of sparkling water, his body stiffening the moment he saw her. "Mother," he said evenly, setting the glass down, "this is unexpected." "I don't have the luxury of waiting for an invitation," Harriet replied, her gaze narrowing. "We need to talk." "About what?" William asked, his tone calm but edged with impatience. "About Sarah," Harriet said, her voice laced with disapproval. "This arrangement of yours has gone too far." William straightened, his jaw tightening. "Whatever you think this is, Mother, it's not your concern. It became my concern the moment you jeopardized this family's reputation," Harriet snapped, her composure slipping. "That girl is a liability. She doesn't belong in your world, and you know it. She belongs wherever I say she does," William replied, his voice firm. "And, for the record, Sarah isn't a liability. She's the reason I've started to see the world differently. Maybe you should consider doing the same." Harriet's lips pressed into a thin line, her frustration boiling beneath the surface. "This isn't about me, William. It's about what's best for you and for this company. What's best for me," William said, his voice rising slightly, "is to stop living according to other people's expectations. Sarah has shown me that. She's challenged me in ways no one else has, and for the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually living." Harriet's expression faltered for a moment, surprise flickering in her eyes, but she quickly recovered, her tone hardening. "You're blinded by emotion. This girl will only drag you down." "Enough," William said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You don't get to dictate my life anymore, Mother. I appreciate everything you've done for me, but this is my choice, and I'm choosing Sarah." Harriet stared at him, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the hurt beneath her steely exterior. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their confrontation hanging heavily between them. "If that's how you feel," Harriet said finally, her voice quieter but no less firm, "then you'll have to live with the consequences." Without another word, she turned and left, the door closing softly behind her. William stood still for a moment, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. The confrontation had left him drained, but resolute. Meanwhile, Sarah was at her apartment, preparing dinner with Emily. The familiar routine was comforting, a reminder of the life she had built before everything with William had turned her world upside down. But as she chopped vegetables, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. "You've been quiet," Emily observed, glancing at her sister. "Just thinking," Sarah replied, her tone distracted. Emily set down the spoon she was using to stir the pot on the stove and turned to face her sister. "About William?" Sarah sighed, putting down the knife. "It's complicated, Em. He's trying, but his world, it's exhausting. The scrutiny, the expectations, it's like living under a microscope." "But you care about him," Emily said gently. "Enough to try." Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting her sister's. "I do, but sometimes I wonder if it's enough. Before Emily could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sarah wiped her hands on a towel and opened it to find William standing there, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "William," she said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Can we talk?" Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. Emily gave her sister a knowing look before slipping into her bedroom, leaving them alone. William turned to face Sarah, his gaze intense. "I just had a confrontation with my mother." Sarah crossed her arms, her stomach tightening. "Let me guess. She thinks I'm not good enough for you." "She's wrong," William said firmly. "And I told her that. I told her I'm choosing you." The words hit Sarah like a wave, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over her. "You said that?" "Yes," he replied, stepping closer, "because it's true. Sarah, I've spent my entire life trying to live up to other people's expectations, my father's, my mother's, the board's. But with you, I've realized that I need to live for myself, and I want to live that life with you." Her heart ached at his honesty, but fear still lingered in the corners of her mind. "William, what happens when the next challenge comes? When the media digs deeper, or the board pushes back even harder? Will you still choose me?" "I will," he said, his voice unwavering, "because you're the only person who makes me feel like I'm more than just a name or a title. You see me, Sarah, the real me, and I can't lose that." Tears filled her eyes, and she looked away, trying to steady herself. "This isn't just about us, William. It's about everything that comes with being part of your world." "I know," he said, reaching for her hand. "And I'm ready to face it, as long as you're with me." She met his gaze, searching for any hint of doubt, but all she saw was sincerity, the walls he had built around himself crumbling before her. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "but this has to be a partnership, William. No more shielding me from the truth, no more half measures." "Agreed," he said, a small smile breaking through the tension. "We'll face it together." As they stood there, their hands entwined, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she believed they could navigate it, together, as equals. The conference room at Hargrove Enterprises buzzed with subdued conversation, the faint hum of voices blending with the soft rustle of papers. This was the first major meeting since William's declaration to his mother, and the air was thick with unspoken tension. Sarah sat beside William at the long glass table, her posture poised, but her nerves simmering beneath the surface. Across the table, Harriet Hargrove sat like a queen surveying her court, her expression unreadable but her presence commanding. Sarah could feel Harriet's gaze flicker toward her now and then, sharp and assessing, but she refused to look away. She had spent too long doubting her place here. Now she was determined to own it. Charles Wentworth, ever the affable strategist, leaned forward to address the room. "Before we dive into quarterly figures, I'd like to acknowledge the strides we've made with our new philanthropic partnerships. Sarah's mentorship program proposal, in particular, has garnered significant interest from potential investors." The room murmured in agreement, a few nodding in approval. Harriet's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened slightly around the pen in her hand. "Thank you, Charles," William said, his tone measured but firm. "Sarah's insights have been invaluable, and I believe this program represents the kind of forward-thinking approach that will define Hargrove Enterprises moving forward." Sarah glanced at him, her chest tightening at the confidence in his voice. He didn't look at her, but the way he spoke, deliberate, unwavering, felt like an unspoken acknowledgement of her importance, not just in the company, but in his life. Harriet's gaze shifted to William, her lips thinning slightly. "It's certainly a bold move," she said, her tone cool, "but boldness without strategy can lead to instability." "With respect, Mother," William replied, his voice calm but carrying an edge, "I believe stability comes from adaptability. The world is changing, and so must we." The exchange hung in the air like a drawn sword, but before anyone could respond, William turned to Eleanor. "Let's move on to the financial projections." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of charts and discussions, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being caught in a silent war. Harriet's resistance was palpable, but so was William's resolve. For the first time, she felt like they were truly standing side by side, facing the challenges together. Later that evening, Sarah returned to her Brooklyn apartment, her mind still reeling from the day's events. Emily was waiting in the kitchen, a plate of freshly baked cookies on the counter. "How was it?" Emily asked, offering her sister a cookie. "Intense," Sarah admitted, taking a bite. The sweet, warm taste was a welcome comfort after the day's tension. "Harriet was herself," Emily snorted. "I'm guessing that's not a compliment." "Not exactly," Sarah said with a wry smile. "But William stood up to her. He supported me, even when it wasn't easy." Emily studied her, her expression softening. "He's really trying, isn't he?" "He is," Sarah said, her voice quieter now, "and I think, for the first time, I actually believe him." Emily reached over, squeezing her hand. "That's progress, Sarah." "Real progress," Sarah nodded, the knot in her chest loosening slightly. "It is, but it's still hard, Em. There's so much pressure, so many expectations. I'm not sure I'll ever feel like I truly belong in his world." Emily tilted her head, her gaze thoughtful. "Maybe you're not supposed to belong in his world. Maybe the two of you are meant to create your own." The words hit Sarah like a revelation, their truth sinking deep. For so long, she had been trying to fit into William's life, to mold herself into something she wasn't. But maybe Emily was right. Maybe the key wasn't changing herself, but finding a way to blend their lives into something new. A few days later, William surprised Sarah by showing up at her apartment unannounced. He was dressed casually, his usual polished demeanor softened by the warmth in his eyes. "I thought you might like a night off," he said, holding up a takeout bag from their favorite Thai place. Sarah laughed, stepping aside to let him in. "You think food solves everything, don't you?" "It's worked so far," he said with a smirk, setting the bag on the table. They ate together, the conversation flowing easily. For the first time in weeks, the tension between them felt like a distant memory. They talked about everything: work, family, even their favorite childhood memories, and with each word, Sarah felt the trust between them rebuilding. After dinner, they sat on the couch, the remains of their meal forgotten on the coffee table. William leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice quiet. "About honesty, about partnership." "And," Sarah prompted, her heart pounding. "And I want you to know that I'm all in," he said, turning to face her. "No more hiding, no more half measures. Whatever comes next, I want us to face it together." Her breath caught, the sincerity in his words leaving her momentarily speechless. "William!" He reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "I know I've made mistakes, Sarah. I know I've hurt you. But I'm trying. And I promise I'll keep trying." She looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions: fear, hope, love. Slowly, she nodded. "Then we take it one step at a time." A small smile tugged at his lips, and he squeezed her hand, one step at a time. As they sat together, the city lights casting a soft glow through the windows, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time she believed they could walk it together, and that was enough. The morning sunlight poured through the large windows of William's office, illuminating the polished wood and sleek lines of the space. Sarah stood near the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines of legal volumes as she waited. She had agreed to meet William to discuss the mentorship program and some final preparations for an upcoming investor luncheon. But a part of her couldn't ignore the unease in her stomach. "Sorry to keep you waiting," William said as he entered, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see him adjusting his cufflinks, his tie slightly loosened. It was a rare sight, and it made him appear almost approachable. She offered a small smile. "It's fine. I was just admiring your collection. You actually read these?" "Some," he replied, smirking. "The rest are for show." The tension in the room lightened briefly, but the weight of their discussion soon settled between them. William gestured toward the seating area, and they both sat down, a coffee table separating them. "The mentorship program is progressing well," Sarah began, handing him a report. "We've secured commitments from 3 new corporate sponsors, and the pilot schools are already reporting increased student engagement." "That's impressive," William said, flipping through the pages. "You've done an incredible job with this." "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But we still have a long way to go." He nodded, setting the report aside. "I want to make sure we're giving this program the visibility it deserves. I've arranged for a feature in the New York Times, an in-depth piece highlighting the initiative and the stories behind it." Her eyes widened. "You're putting it in the Times?" "It's time we shared this with the world," he said, leaning forward. "This program is about more than just good PR. It's about real change, and you're the one who made it happen." His words touched her, but they also made her wary. "You're sure this isn't just about improving the company's image?" "It's not," he said firmly. "This is personal, Sarah, and I want you to be front and center." She hesitated, her mind racing. The idea of such a public spotlight unsettled her, but the sincerity in his voice made her pause. "I'll think about it." "Fair," he replied, leaning back, "but the board will need an answer soon." The mention of the board brought another layer of tension to the room. Harriet's reaction to their growing closeness had been colder than ever, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for an opportunity to strike. "Speaking of the board," Sarah said carefully, "how are they handling us?" William's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "They're divided. Charles is supportive, but others, let's just say they're less enthusiastic." "And Harriet?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's not happy, but I made it clear that this is my decision, not hers." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a flicker of guilt. She had known from the start that stepping into William's world would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated how much resistance they would face. "William," she said, her tone careful, "if this becomes too much, if the pressure from the board or your mother gets to be more than you can handle, just tell me." His eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice firm. "That's not going to happen. I've spent too long letting other people dictate my life. I'm not going back." She nodded, her chest tightening at the intensity in his gaze. For all the challenges they faced, William's determination to stand by her was unwavering. It was both comforting and terrifying. Later that evening, Sarah found herself walking along the Brooklyn Bridge, the city lights reflecting in the water below. She had needed some air, some space to process everything that had happened. The mentorship program, the media attention, Harriet's disapproval. It all felt like an enormous weight resting on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed, and she pulled it from her pocket to see a message from Emily. "How's the superhero life? Saving kids and melting billionaires' hearts." Sarah couldn't help but smile, her sister's humor a welcome distraction. She typed a quick reply, "Something like that. But even superheroes need a break." As she slid her phone back into her pocket, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw William approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The cool night air made his breath visible, but his expression was warm. "How did you know I'd be here?" she asked as he stopped beside her. "Call it a lucky guess," he replied. "Or maybe I just know you." She smiled faintly, turning her gaze back to the water. "It's a lot, William. All of it. The program, the board, your mother. Sometimes I feel like I'm in over my head." "You're not," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." "Maybe," she said, her voice tinged with doubt, "but I can't do this alone." "You don't have to," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "We're in this together, remember?" She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, but all she saw was sincerity, the walls he had once built around himself nowhere in sight. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady. "Together." As they stood on the bridge, the city bustling around them, Sarah felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known in weeks. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it, not as an outsider in William's world, but as an equal partner in building something new. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of rain as Sarah made her way into the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Club. This wasn't just another event. It was the official launch of the mentorship program she and William had worked tirelessly to bring to life. The room was alive with energy, executives mingling with educators, journalists scribbling notes, and students nervously clutching their name tags. Sarah adjusted her deep green dress, a subtle nod to her signature style, and took a deep breath. The enormity of what they had accomplished hung over her like a weighted curtain. It wasn't just the program itself, it was the journey that had brought her to this moment, standing alongside William in a world that had once felt impossibly distant. "Sarah," a familiar voice called, and she turned to see Charles Wentworth approaching. His broad smile was genuine, and he extended a hand in greeting. "This is quite the turnout. You've outdone yourself." "It was a team effort," Sarah replied, her tone modest but warm. "But thank you. It's been a long road to get here." "Well, you should be proud," Charles said, his voice lowering slightly. "And for what it's worth, I've seen a change in William. You've had a good influence on him." Sarah's cheeks flushed, but before she could respond, Charles excused himself, leaving her standing amidst the hum of conversation and clinking glasses. She scanned the room, her eyes finding William near the stage. He was deep in conversation with Harriet, their expressions tense but not hostile. It was a sight that would have once unnerved her, but tonight she felt a quiet confidence. Harriet's approval was no longer a goal, it was an optional bonus. As the evening progressed, the program's success became undeniable. Several of the students spoke about their experiences, their words heartfelt and raw. Sarah felt a lump in her throat as a young girl shared how the mentorship had given her the confidence to pursue a dream of becoming an engineer. "That was incredible," William said, appearing at Sarah's side as the girl stepped off the stage. His voice was soft, the admiration in his eyes clear. "She was brave," Sarah replied, her own voice tinged with emotion. "It makes all the stress worth it." William nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "I couldn't have done this without you. Neither of us could have done it alone," she said, meeting his eyes. "That's the whole point." Later that evening, after the speeches and the applause, Sarah found herself alone on the terrace overlooking the city. The cool air was a welcome reprieve from the warmth of the crowded ballroom, and she wrapped her arms around herself, gazing out at the glittering skyline. "You disappeared," William said from behind her, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. She turned to see him leaning casually against the railing, his tie slightly loosened. Just needed a moment to take it all in. He stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. "You did something incredible tonight." "So did you," she said, smiling faintly. "We made this happen, William. Together." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange. For so long, I thought success meant control, keeping everything in its place, avoiding risk. But this feels different." "It is different," she said, her voice gentle, "because it's real." The words hung between them, and for a moment the city seemed to fade away. William reached for her hand, his touch warm against the evening chill. "I meant what I said earlier," he said quietly. "I can't imagine my life without you, Sarah." Her heart swelled, the sincerity in his voice breaking through the walls she had so carefully built. "William, I know I've made mistakes," he continued, his gaze steady, "but I've learned more from you in the past few months than I have in years. You've challenged me, changed me, and I don't want to go back to the person I was before I met you." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she looked away, trying to steady herself. "I've changed too," she admitted, "but it wasn't just you, it was this whole experience. It's made me realize that I deserve more, that I want more." "You do," he said, his voice firm, "and I want to give that to you. But more than that, I want to build something with you, something that's ours." She turned back to him, her eyes shining. "William, if we do this, it has to be real. No more arrangements. No more games," he smiled, the kind of smile that felt rare and unguarded. "No more games, just us." Sarah nodded, her heart steady for the first time in what felt like forever. "Then let's take that step." As they stood together, the city lights casting a golden glow around them, Sarah felt a quiet sense of triumph. It wasn't the kind of victory that came with applause or recognition. It was the victory of finding her place, of choosing a path that felt true. And as William's hand tightened around hers, she knew they were ready to face whatever came next, together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.